let us discuss Jaghatai Khan, master of maneuver warfare, the Khagan, the Great Khan, the Warhawk. How did the homeworld of Jaghatai Khan shape his upbringing? How might his moral values have been different if he had been raised in the cities of his homeworld rather than on the steppes? Jaghatai Khan's upbringing on the steppes of Chogoris was what made his personality, moral values, leadership style, and style of warfare. It emphasized freedom, adaptability, maneuverability, and loyalty to kin. But, then again, what is the value of nature versus nurture? Perhaps Jaghatai Khan's infant form subconsciously chose Chogoris for itself. Who knows? The mystery of the Primarchs. The steppes demanded resilience, self-reliance, and resourcefulness. These traits became central to Jaghatai's identity and later shaped the culture of the White Scars Legion and various successor chapters. Survival often depended on swift decision-making and adaptability, reflected in his lightning-fast, unpredictable warfare. The nomadic tribes valued freedom and rejected rigid hierarchies. Jaghatai internalized these values, developing a disdain for authoritarianism and excessive bureaucracy. Loyalty and camaraderie among tribe members became paramount, shaping his view of leadership as a duty to his people rather than as a privilege. That's right, I'm directly calling out Rabute Gilliman. Constant conflict among the tribes taught Jaghatai the importance of strategy, honor, and the necessity of fighting for survival. The honor-driven culture of the steppes instilled in him a code of ethics, emphasizing personal accountability and respect for the strength of adversaries. Life on the steppes forged a deep bond with the natural world. Jaghatai valued the simplicity of life, unburdened by the complexities of urban civilization. If he had a hypothetical upbringing in the cities, we might have seen a very different Primarch. Growing up in the structured society of the cities would have given him a greater appreciation for organization and hierarchy, or at least a greater exposure to bureaucracy. Who knows whether he would have liked it. He might have developed a more rigid sense of order, aligning him more closely with Primarchs like Gilliman, Dorn, and Fulgrim. Urban life had stratified social structures in a way which was much less evident in the steppes. This might have fostered a sharper awareness of inequality and possibly a sense of ambition to rise above one's station. He might have become more expedient, more caring about results and less idealistic about concepts like freedom and loyalty, and this would have been a great loss to the Imperium. The cities of Chogoris, though, were centers of art, philosophy, and learning. An urban upbringing might have given Jaghatai a different type of intellectual sophistication, and perhaps aligning him with Fulgrim in his appreciation for the culture of civilization. Perhaps this might have shifted his moral values to prioritize legacy building and civilization over personal freedom and self-determination. A city-based life would, of course, have distanced him from the raw, untamed beauty of the steppes, potentially dulling his appreciation for the natural world and its role in shaping his philosophy. Jaghatai's canonical tribal upbringing on the steppes fostered a moral code that valued personal honor, loyalty to one's kin, and the rejection of tyranny. He saw freedom as sacred and despised oppression, thus influencing his reluctance to fully embrace the rigid structures of the Imperium, whereas a hypothetical urban upbringing might have then shifted his values more towards the expedient outcome-based view of governance, emphasizing the importance of structure, hierarchy, civilization, and the consolidation of power within institutions in order to ensure stability and legacy. Jaghatai's upbringing on the steppes was crucial to his identity as a free-spirited, honor-driven warrior who valued personal freedom above all else. A city-based upbringing might have thus transformed him into a more conventional leader, but it would have stripped away the unique traits that made him such a compelling figure. Understanding his development thus highlights how environment shapes not just personality, but eventually the ethos of entire legions. Certain Primarchs were raised in two different cultures, and had different reasons for leaving one culture for a different one. I shall now attempt to make an exhaustive list from the 18 known Primarchs. Horus was raised on Chthoniya, but was found early enough in his life and had a long enough period of acclimation with the Emperor that it is reasonable to describe that period as being part of his adolescence, rather than being two adulthood cultures. But of course, canon is a little iffy for Horus, so whatever. Leman Russ was raised in the wolf pack, and then brought to humanity by a hunting party of humans on Fenris. Mortarion was first raised by Overlord Nekare of Barbarous before leaving in an act of rebellion to join the humans of Barbarous. Ferrus Manus, Lionel Johnson, Conrad Coors, and Angron, depending on canon, lived in solitude for unknown lengths of time prior to meeting humanity, but I'm not sure if that counts as a different culture, really. From analysis of the Primarchs who were raised in two different cultures, what can we learn about how being exposed to different perspectives so early in their lives shaped their personalities? Horus went from Chthoniya's brutal gang-dominated society to the Emperor's direct tutelage at the heights of what passed for human civilization in those days before the unification of Terra had finished. Horus's early exposure to Chthoniya's ruthlessness made him pragmatic and decisive, skills that translated well to his role as War Master. But also, he understood exactly how bad it was, so he didn't want to recreate that writ large. He knew how to deal with it when it showed up. His experience navigating Chthoniya's cutthroat environment likely honed his ability to build alliances and command loyalty. But again, depending on canon, he may have been removed from that earlier or later. Meanwhile, the transition from a survivalist upbringing to the Emperor's more structured and idealistic vision may have left him with lingering insecurities about his place and purpose. But those weren't his biggest problems. Leman Russ, of course, was the biggest example here. He went from being raised by wolves to then joining Fenrisian humanity in a kind of Viking-styled culture. The wolf pack thus instilled in Russ an unshakable sense of loyalty, family, and the importance of collective strength, thus becoming central to his leadership of the Space Wolves. Transitioning to a human culture required Russ to temper his feral instincts with discipline and adopt a more structured sense of honor and duty. Russ's dual identity made him deeply proud of his origins, but it also left him somewhat sensitive to criticism about his wild nature compared to the more refined Primarchs. But we'll get to Russ another time. Mortarion is a particularly interesting case because he chose to leave one culture for another. He went from being raised by Nekare, probably the second worst person in all of 40k, to joining the oppressed human population of Barbarous by choice. His rebellion against Nekare shaped his hatred for oppression and instilled a personal code of fighting for the downtrodden, which lasted up until he joined the Traitors. Surviving Barbarous's toxic environment and overthrowing Nekare demonstrated Mortarion's resilience and capacity for long-term planning. But then his bitterness over his foster father's tyranny, and then the Emperor's intervention to prevent him from winning on his own, bred a mistrust of authority figures, which later alienated him from the Imperium, ultimately leading to a greater openness for chaos corruption. But again, we'll get to Mortarion elsewhere. Those Primarchs who spent time alone, spending formative years in solitude before encountering human society, or in the case of Conrad Kors, at least before engaging with human society. He was like near humans the whole time. Anyway, Ferrus Manus, his solitude nurtured his focus on perfection and strength, his sense of self-reliance, and so that's what he taught his legion. He made each great company to be self-reliant. Lionel Johnson's isolation in Caliban's forests, surrounded by giant monsters, sharpened his tactical mind and inner discipline, while also making him secretive and distrustful. Conrad Kors, as we spoke about earlier, alone on the brutal streets of Nostramo, living off of scraps and garbage. He developed, from observation of humanity at its worst, a fear-based philosophy of justice and maintenance of order. He understood human darkness quite well. But then Angron, depending on canon, may have been alone in the wild for some time before being captured and forced into the gladiatorial pits as a slave. His then rage and mistrust and difficulty bonding with others who didn't go through what he did might come in part from his whiplash effect, being taken from his happy childhood on his own. From these, we can see that solitude fosters independence and problem-solving abilities, but also perhaps deprived these Primarchs of early opportunities for emotional connection. We can see Ferrus Manus, Lionel Johnson, and Angron as having somewhat standoffish personalities, not particularly open to making friends with new people. From these cultural shifts, we can see that Primarchs exposed to two different cultures perhaps can be said overall to have become more adaptable and capable of navigating complex moral dynamics. Horus used this to build alliances, and Mortarion became a champion of the oppressed, for example. It would have been easy for Mortarion to bring the order into the Imperium intact, for example, but instead he worked to free the people who were chemically enslaved. Anyway, those who transitioned away from oppressive or harsh upbringings retained deep distrust of authority or rigidity. Mortarion rebelled against the Emperor's perceived authoritarianism, and Angron saw the Imperium as just another slave master. Angron's purest life was out in the wilderness by himself before being enslaved, but a close second was being out in the wilderness with his brothers from the gladiatorial arenas, fleeing for their lives. Shifting between cultures perhaps can be said to cultivate resilience and versatility, but also leave emotional fault lines. For Horus, this manifested as insecurity and a desire for validation. But for Russ, it reinforced loyalty and the ability to thrive with dual identities. Overall, perhaps we can see that these Primarchs who had multiple different cultures had some amount of alienation or being othered, even among their peers. Mortarion and Angron felt that their suffering was being misunderstood or dismissed by their brothers and their father, thus fueling their later decisions, whereas Ferrus Manus and Lionel Johnson were on their own for so long that they never really internalized that sometimes you have to count on other people. These dual cultural experiences of several of the Primarchs emphasized adaptability and emotional complexity, but they also reveal a recurring theme that the scars of one's culture, and in particular transitioning from one culture to another, later manifested in their relationships with the Emperor, their brothers, their legions, and the Imperium overall. Thus, understanding these fault lines illuminates both the strengths and vulnerabilities of these Primarchs affected, helping to explain their later choices and the trajectories of their lives. With all of that put together, from these analyses and from what we've already looked at for Jaghatai Khan's early life on the steppes, I think that perhaps it may have improved his moral character to have lived in the cities for a time before transitioning to the steppes, perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps he was out on the steppes at the head of some city-based military expedition and gained respect for the nomads' fighting spirit after a skirmish with them. It would have at least introduced moral complexities and broadened his character. Now, saying whether it would have indeed, as I suspect, improved his moral character would have depended on the nature of experiences and how that interacted with his inner nature. Let's take a little look-see. By being exposed to the city civilization culture and then afterwards the steppes, we might have had him gain a more nuanced understanding of the culture, politics, and struggles of the city dwellers. He might have gained insight into why they feared or resented the nomadic people of the steppes. Perhaps this might have fostered empathy for their perspective. Experiencing the challenges of city life, notably political corruption and class disparity, might have taught him to appreciate the complexities of governance and justice. He might have learned to temper the nomadic ideals of freedom and strength with a recognition of the city's need for stability and structure. Engaging with both cultures would have almost certainly honed his ability to mediate conflict between people from different cultures and to thus bring people together by finding their commonalities. The dual perspective might have made him a more effective leader in unifying Chagoris through diplomacy rather than just Genghis Khan-style warfare, but it's hard to say. Of course, then again, witnessing the failings of city life firsthand could have reinforced his respect for the nomad's way of life, perhaps with a tempered appreciation for what the cities could offer. But then there's risks associated with all of this. Perhaps spending time in the cities might have allowed him to witness the city's worst aspects: greed, betrayal, oppression, inequality, systemic poverty. He might have thus become cynical or embittered, risking a loss of his moral clarity. Or by spending only part of his adulthood with the nomads of the steppes, it may have led to a diluted identity as a nomad, a warrior. His strong sense of justice and freedom that he gained from his steppe upbringing might have clashed with the rigid hierarchies and laws of the city that he would have grown up with, and this conflict between his values may have led to inner turmoil or frustration. Plus, if he had a prolonged childhood and adolescence and some of his adulthood in the cities, that might have alienated him from the nomads, making his eventual integration into their culture more challenging. Jaghatai's moral character, shaped by the steppes, emphasized freedom, loyalty, and swift justice. These traits made him an effective leader and warrior, but left him perhaps somewhat aloof and dismissive of rigid social structures, less able to connect with those Primarchs who had grown up in civilization. Perhaps time in the cities might have allowed him to see the value in stability and institutions, while still allowing his belief in freedom and honor to come forth from time in the steppes. But if his time in the cities was marked by acute exposure to the worst aspects of civilization, perhaps it might have deepened his disdain for centralization of power, pushing him further towards isolationist thinking. Jaghatai's potential for cultural duality might be most comparable to that of Leman Russ, or Mortarion, who, as we mentioned before, transitioned between different societies. Leman Russ thrived in balancing his wolfpack origins and values with his Fenrisian humanity and culture. But then Mortarion carried resentment for his first culture into his second, thus fueling his later bitterness when the emperor did not allow him to address the baggage from his first culture before being brought to the Imperium. If Jaghatai had followed a path closer to Russ, he might have grown into a more compassionate and diplomatic leader. But if he mirrored Mortarion, perhaps his moral compass could have been skewed further towards hostility and rebellion. Thus, we can see that Time in the Cities might have refined Jaghatai's moral character by exposing him to different perspectives and teaching him to navigate social complexities of a hierarchical, institution-based world. But it also would have risked corrupting or alienating him, depending on his experiences. So it's hard to say that it would have been an improvement to his moral self. In canon, his upbringing on the steppes gave him a clarity of purpose and a strong moral foundation, which perhaps was more effective for his unique role within the Imperium. The timing for the Emperor meeting each of his sons played a critical role in shaping their character arcs, their relationship with the Emperor, and their thematic contributions later to the Horus Heresy narrative. We should compare and contrast the timing of the Emperor meeting Jaghatai Khan with his discovery of Corax, Lorgar, and Angron. The Emperor met Jaghatai Khan after the Khan had already united the tribes of the steppes, forged a powerful nomadic empire, and ended the tyranny of the cities on Chagoris. Jaghatai was an established ruler and warrior philosopher, deeply grounded in his belief in freedom, personal strength, and loyalty. The Emperor's arrival thus aligned with the Khan's ideals of uniting disparate peoples and fighting tyranny. Jaghatai accepted the Emperor's vision with little resistance because it resonated with his values. Jaghatai was one of those Primarchs who freely chose to join the Emperor without straightforward coercion or significant ideological clashes, kind of like Sanguinius or Fulgrim. This highlights the idea of loyalty born from shared purpose rather than imposed obligation. Though, in canon, the Emperor did show up at Chagoris with some of the Luna Wolves Legion there, which is an implied threat. Anyway, the Khan's autonomy within the Great Crusade reflects the challenges of centralizing power in a galaxy-wide imperium. His timing demonstrates how a loyalist can thus retain individuality and free will. He had already achieved on his own, so the Emperor knew and believed that he could continue to achieve without micromanaging. Corax is singular among the Primarchs. The Emperor found Corax after the Primarch had already begun his war to liberate Lysaeus, later Deliverance, from the Tech Guild oppressors of Kievar through guerrilla warfare. He had become a symbol of liberation and justice for his people, but the Emperor arrived alone, if I remember canon correctly, before Corax had achieved final victory. He decided to leave, to give Corax more time, so that Corax might achieve victory with his own methods on his own merits. Corax was thus deeply influenced by his people's struggles and maintained a strong moral compass rooted in opposing tyranny, and the Emperor's decision showed Corax how much he was trusted. Corax's liberation narrative thus emphasizes the role of moral conviction and justice in the Imperium's foundation, and how much trust the Emperor had that this narrative was worth being allowed to play out. Like Jaghatai Khan, Corax aligned with the Emperor's most idealistic vision for the Imperium, but his actions often highlighted the contradictions between those ideals and the reality of the Imperium's authoritarian rule. The Emperor arrived on Colchis after Lorgar had already established a theocratic society centered around worship of a divine being, which Lorgar identified as the Emperor. This is a complicated one, so we're going to spend a lot of time on it later. Had the Emperor found Lorgar earlier, before his theocratic wars had purged a third of his planet in order to rid what he didn't know was the taint of chaos from the population, perhaps the Emperor might have guided him differently. The timing of Lorgar being found reflects the tension between his faith and the secular imperial truth. His fall highlights how ideals like devotion can be corrupted when they clash with rigid ideology. Lorgar's story is thus a tragedy of unmet emotional needs, where timing played a critical role in his eventual betrayal. The Emperor, of course, as we went over earlier, found Angron at the height of his rebellion against the slave-holding high riders of Nuceria. He was surrounded by his doomed slave army, the Eaters of Cities, at the plateau of Fedan Mor, ready to fight their last stand. And the Emperor intervened only to teleport Angron away, abandoning his army to annihilation by superior numbers. Angron's forced removal from the battle of his choice left him embittered and broken. He never forgave the Emperor for denying him the chance to fight alongside his comrades and potentially die with them. This resentment defined his relationship with the Imperium, and honestly, the Emperor should have been able to predict that. Angron's story exemplifies the cost of coercion over compassion, which we also see with Mortarion, come to think of it. The Emperor's timing robbed Angron of agency and reinforced the futility of loyalty imposed through force. Angron's tragedy is thus rooted in the Emperor's inability or unwillingness to meet him on equal terms, a direct contrast to Jaghatai's voluntary loyalty, and also a direct contrast to the Emperor being willing to meet certain Primarchs on equal terms according to their cultures, notably Leman Russ and Vulcan. Anyway, we can contrast some of this. Jaghatai and Corax both embraced the Emperor's vision after success, and they maintained their individuality and moral convictions. Whereas Lorgar and Angron, for different reasons, their timing of being found created unbridgeable rifts with the Emperor, emphasizing the dangers of neglecting emotional needs and cultural contexts. And so, the timing of the Emperor's discovery of each Primarch deeply shaped their personalities and their thematic arcs. Jaghatai Khan's harmonious integration into the Great Crusade contrasts with the tragedies of Lorgar and Angron, but is very similar to the story of Corax, thus showcasing the importance of timing and, more importantly, respect and understanding in relationships. Now, we're going to speculate a bit. And you're a half hour into this video, so you're just going to keep watching. Come on, you're not going to skip ahead. What if the Emperor had arrived before some climactic final battle between the Khan's horde and a grand army of the cities? Would the Emperor have been likely to allow Jaghatai the chance to win on his own, like what he did with Corax, or would he have taken him away like what he did with Angron? I think it's reasonable to speculate that he might have chosen a similar approach to what he did with Corax, allowing Jaghatai to secure victory on his own. Here's some reasons why I think that. The Emperor was interested in testing the leadership and capability of his various Primarchs. He sought to assess his son's abilities before fully integrating them into the Great Crusade. In canon, he saw that Jaghatai had won, and so he put him directly into the Great Crusade with no period of mentorship or acclamation. In this alternate scenario, by observing Jaghatai's leadership and strategic prowess during a pivotal battle, being able to observe directly, he might have been able to evaluate the Khan's strengths. The Emperor valued self-reliance in many of his Primarchs, as evidenced by his actions with Corax. He needed them to be able to fight without him holding their hand, because the galaxy was a big place. If he had left Jaghatai to win the battle on his own terms, the Emperor would thus reinforce the Khan's self-confidence, thus making him more willing to be autonomous and independent in the new circumstance of leading a legion. Further, the Emperor did understand the importance of cultural context. One of the first Primarch, I think it was exactly the second Primarch he met, was Leman Russ, where he engaged with Russ on the terms of his own culture. The Emperor could see, and probably even remember from history, the whole Genghis Khan thing going on with Jaghatai. He knew that this approach to warfare was deeply tied to the identity and culture of the steppes, and thus, recognizing this, he might have understood that stepping in would undermine Jaghatai's authority among his people and disrupt the natural progression of his leadership. A victory achieved by Jaghatai alone would thus have solidified his legitimacy as a leader among the nomads. The Emperor, knowing the importance of symbolism, might have seen the value in letting the Khan claim this victory for himself. Now, we know that at the time, there was a big sense of urgency in the Great Crusade. The Emperor knew that time was of the essence. So if it had been a situation where there was like several months remaining before a big battle, he might have just gotten Jaghatai Khan out of there. But like on the eve of a battle, wait 20 hours. We can afford that. Let him win. If he had seen that the nomads were at a significant disadvantage and the risk of Jaghatai's defeat and death was high, the Emperor might have stepped in to prevent losing a Primarch. But this was an extreme case. He only intervened with Angron because he was definitely going to lose that next battle and die in it. And Angron wanted to die in it. Corax was not exactly in a great position strategically when the Emperor found him the first time, but he let Corax proceed with his own strategy and ultimately win anyway. So overall, I think it's pretty straightforward to say that the Emperor would have allowed Khan the opportunity to win the battle on his own. Jaghatai Khan was found well before Corax. Jaghatai valued independence and was deeply tied to his culture's method of warfare. Perhaps having had the experience of seeing what Jaghatai was like after he won on his own, the Emperor in canon decided to specifically allow Corax to develop similar independence and reliance on his respective culture's method of warfare in order to shape Corax to be independent and autonomous, similar to Jaghatai. The Emperor did learn things sometimes when he interacted with his Primarchs. Now, the culture of the steppes was built on personal honor and the strength of leaders. A victory won by someone else, the Emperor, would have been more disruptive to Jaghatai's standing among his people than perhaps it might have been for Corax among the oppressed miners and prisoners of Lycaeus. But ultimately, I think allowing Corax to win his war on his own terms because he knew that such a path could be successful because he had the example of the Khan, I think that's a reasonable inference from canon. Now, let's look at this from one more thing. We already mentioned how with Vulcan and Leman Russ, the Emperor engaged with their culture on his own terms. What if Jaghatai had challenged the Emperor to a series of traditional cultural challenges like Vulcan or Russ? I feel that this could have been accomplished from a friendly, getting-to-know-you perspective, even if the Khan had known that he would join the Imperium at the end of the games. It doesn't need to be a, if you win, then I'll join you sort of situation like with Russ. There were a bunch of Mongolian-style sports which would have been good options. That's what Games Workshop's going for. Chogoris is Mongolia. That's what we're seeing. The cities are China. The steppes are Mongolia. He is Genghis Khan. That's what we're getting at, okay? If he'd had a contest to demonstrate his values and build rapport, it might have been symbolic and emotionally significant. It could have highlighted his cultural heritage, his personality, established a dynamic between him and his father. By participating in traditional challenges and games and sports and stuff from Jaghatai's culture, the emperor would thus be signaling respect for Jaghatai's cultural identity and autonomy. This would thus foster trust and mutual respect, rather than asserting authority through force. For Jaghatai, inviting the emperor to partake in his own culture's games would reflect his willingness to integrate his culture into the Imperium as an equal contributor to its greater whole. But also, it would have indicated respect for the emperor, being willing to share this part of his life with his father. There's a bunch of sports and games and stuff which would have been good options. Mongolian horse archery, with its need for precision, focus, and adaptability, would thus symbolize the values of freedom and masteries over one's circumstances, attributes which Jaghatai Khan hoped to bring from Chogoris into the Imperium. Horse racing, which I believe is called Nadam, though I'm not completely sure. It represents speed, endurance, connection with nature, mastery of a skill, the nomadic spirit overall, the pursuit of unbridled freedom. Well, maybe a bridle for the horse. These were principles that Jaghatai Khan held dear and sought to defend. Mongolian wrestling, which I believe is called Bok, though I could be pronouncing that wrong, emphasizes honor, strength, and camaraderie, vaguely sumo style. It could symbolize Jaghatai's desire to meet challenges head on, but also show the emperor that he had a sense of fairness and respect for his opponent, a metaphor both for his relationship with the emperor and also a value that he did in canon bring to compliance campaigns. He was very interested in offering surrender to worthy opponents so that they might add their strength to the Imperium. Had the emperor participated in challenges that were a part of Jaghatai Khan's upbringing, this might have thus humanized the emperor in the Khan's eyes, making it easier for him to see the emperor as something more like a father figure rather than a distant godlike ruler. This is basically what happened with Leman Russ and Vulcan. This is why they respected the emperor and were so loyal to him their whole lives. It's because of that first interaction where he interacted with them as equals. These games might have allowed the emperor a chance to connect with a Primarch in a more casual, joyful way. Such moments of camaraderie were rare in the emperor's life and might have helped to bridge the emotional distance that characterized the emperor's relationships with his sons. With Leman Russ and Vulcan, having the emperor participate in traditional challenges served as a metaphor for the integration of their home planet's ideals and values with the larger Imperium. By excelling and inviting the emperor to participate and overall excel to an even higher degree, those Primarchs were symbolically asserting that their culture and values had a place in the Imperium's future, and showing their respect for the emperor by giving him a chance to be victorious in fair contest. If Jaghatai had wanted to understand the emperor's character, these challenges might have served as a test. Was the emperor willing to engage with the Khan on his own cultural terms, or would the emperor dismiss the games as frivolous? When he met the emperor, he had no knowledge of what had happened with Lehman Russ. He had no precedent to go off of. A friendly competition could perhaps establish a sense of balance, setting the stage for a relationship built on mutual respect rather than dominance and subordination. The potential outcomes for such an interaction are pretty much all positive. Shared participation in traditional cultural challenges could have led to a closer emotional connection between Jaghatai and the emperor, potentially mitigating some of the Khan's later feelings of distance from the Imperium. This symbolic acceptance of the Primarch's way of life could have thus inspired a broader respect for cultural diversity within the Imperium. Most specifically, people hearing that the Emperor had done horse archery with Jaghatai Khan might have thus made people less interested in disrespecting the White Scars Legion later due to their perception as being barbaric. And of course, by showing respect for Jaghatai's traditions and culture, the Emperor could have secured a deeper emotional loyalty, making him a staunch advocate for the Imperium's vision. In some interpretation of canon, Khan chose to join the Imperium in part because he saw the strength of the Luna Wolves who had been brought by the Emperor, and knew that the alternative to joining was military conquest. A friendly series of equestrian sports would have thus been a better way to manage things than just join or die. It would have symbolized respect, freedom, the merging of traditions. It would be a powerful affirmation that his values mattered and had a place in the Imperium. For the Emperor, it would have been an opportunity to build a rare and meaningful emotionally connection with one of his sons. I feel that this is a missed opportunity, therefore, on the part of the writers. But nobody bats 1,000. Whatever. Games Workshop misses a beat sometimes. It would have been a great narrative tool, a fun story to read. Would have showcased Jaghatai's cultural pride while also humanizing the Emperor in a way which is rare. The Emperor's interactions with his sons generally lack warmth and sometimes lack a sense of mutual respect, so this scene could have added depth to both characters. It's a shame that such opportunities aren't always seized, but also the sprawling nature of Warhammer 40,000's lore and storytelling means that not every thread is explored, leaving room for fans to speculate, reinterpret, fill in the gaps, and make some fan fiction. Maybe the writers will revisit this concept someday. Or maybe us fans will just keep this imagined scene alive over on Archive of Our Own or something. Either way, I like discussing these what-ifs, and you are now an hour into this video. So I hope you also enjoy engaging with the 40K universe in this way. I feel that these what-ifs help keep the story evolving, even in the spaces where it falls short. Jaghatai Khan's transition from the nomadic, honor-driven culture of the steppes of Chogoris to the massive, bureaucratic, and technologically advanced Imperium was a period of profound adjustment. But it was quite short. Unlike some Primarchs who grew up in relatively advanced or hierarchical societies, Jaghatai's upbringing on the steppes emphasized freedom, personal honor, and a direct connection to one's community and environment. The culture shock he experienced during this period provides insight into his unique position among the Emperor's sons, and it was only exacerbated by how short of an adjustment period he had. On the steppes, Jaghatai was both a warrior and a leader, but his authority was tied to his personal strength, charisma, and ability to lead his people in battle. Transitioning to the Imperium, with its rigid hierarchy, bureaucratic structure, and the dominance of the Emperor as an unquestionable autocrat, challenged Jagatai's sense of independence and also his sense of egalitarianism. He was loyal to the emperor, but he found the constraints of the Imperium's structure stifling compared to the freedom he experienced among his nomads. And there's at least some reason to believe he found it to be offensive that he was treated with such respect and deference because he was the son of the emperor, rather than being based off of his own merits, at least at first. The nomads of Chogoris relied on skill, instinct, and the actions of the community, with tools and weapons designed for practicality and survival. The advanced technology of the Imperium, notably for a warrior, the starships, Astartes armor, and the immense machinery of war, represented both an opportunity and a disconnection from his past. He was, of course, a Primarch, so he was a quick learner and adapted to this technology with ease. But he retained a certain disdain for the cold, impersonal nature of Imperial machinery compared to the skill required for traditional horse-mounted archery, for example. This, of course, may be a part of why his legion ended up focused on bikes and jet bikes and armored personnel carriers rather than being built mostly around heavy weapons and dreadnoughts. The steppes fostered a warrior culture deeply tied to nature, personal honor, and kinship. The Imperium, by contrast, was an impersonal, sprawling empire where billions were mere cogs in a vast machine. The disconnection between these worldviews created a sense of alienation for Jaghatai, as he grappled with the Imperium's willingness to sacrifice individual lives for the greater good. His response was to remake the culture of Chogoris within the White Scar's legion so that he could take his culture with him out into the stars. The integration with the legion was thus a mixed blessing. On one hand, the Astartes who became the White Scars shared his drive for excellence and skill in war, even though they had come from Terra. But on the other hand, they were products of the Imperium, and many of them had mindsets shaped by its rigid culture. Jagatai's efforts to immediately mold the White Scars into a cohesive legion which reflected his nomadic ideals and adopted the culture of Chogoris wholesale, emphasizing speed, mobility, interdependence, and an embrace of their adoptive homeworld, served as both a means of adapting to the Imperium and preserving his own cultural identity. The Emperor's imperial truth, meanwhile, its secular rejection of religion and focus on order, conflicted with Jagatai's personal spirituality, shaped by his time on the steppes and exposure to the psychic traditions of Chogoris, the path of heaven. Perhaps this was part of why Jagatai's philosophical alignment with the Imperium was pragmatic rather than wholehearted. Despite this culture shock, Jaghatai adapted to his role within the Imperium with remarkable success, despite having no period of acclimation and no mentorship. Well, okay, he could be said to have a period of acclimation where he waited on Chogoris for the far-flung pieces of the Legion to arrive, but that was pretty much it. His ability to incorporate the lessons of the steppes into the White Scar's doctrine and culture allowed him to remain true to his identity while contributing meaningfully to the Great Crusade. But the tension between the values of Chogoris and those of the Imperium contributed to his occasional aloofness and his preference for operating independently of his brothers. Jagatai's ultimate legacy reflects his ability to bridge these worlds, but it also underscores the challenges faced by the Primarchs in reconciling their upbringing with the demands of the Imperium. For Jaghatai, this period solidified his commitment to freedom and honor, even within the constraints of the Emperor's vision. Let's take a moment and look at the concept of unit-level decision-making in modern military doctrine, and compare it with the nomadic steppe traditions of raiding and hit-and-run warfare. Modern military doctrine in the real world often emphasizes decentralized command structures, especially in contexts requiring flexibility and adaptability, or contexts in which communication may be lost. This approach is encapsulated in concepts like mission command used by NATO forces and the, I'm bad at pronouncing this, okay, hold on, Auftragstaktik, whatever, that's the best you're going to get, of the Prussian military tradition. These methods prioritize clear, overarching goals set by higher command, while empowering subordinate units to determine the means to achieve those goals based on their own situational awareness, because higher command can't see everything that the unit does. Subordinate units can adapt to changing circumstances without having to await further orders. Units thus adjust tactics in real time to exploit opportunities or mitigate threats. And decentralized decision-making reduces delays in response time. Commanders have to be able to trust their subordinates to act in the broader mission's interest. They are still following orders, but you don't need to micromanage them. And effective communication ensures that decisions at lower level align with the strategic objectives at the higher level. This approach is particularly effective in dynamic environments where top-down micromanagement would slow down operations and increase vulnerability. Nomadic steppe warfare, exemplified in the real world by the Mongols and other Central Asian culture, and in 40K, of course, by the White Scars, relies heavily on decentralized decision-making. Leaders like Genghis Khan perfected systems where units operated semi-autonomously, guided by broad strategic goals and deep cultural understanding of warfare. This makes sense because they didn't have access to, for example, radio communication in Central Asia, fighting against seemingly everyone. Hit-and-run tactics thus allowed smaller forces to harry and slow down and chip away at larger, slower armies, sometimes leading to the larger, slower army's ultimate defeat. Forces were able to operate in widely spread formations to confuse enemies, avoid encirclement, and maximize the opportunity to take advantage of weaknesses they find. The Mongol military hierarchy, the Tumen system, divided forces into decimal-based units. You'd have 10 or 100 or 1,000, with leaders empowered to make decisions within their scope, very similar to modern military doctrine regarding decentralized command and unit-based decision-making. Now, they didn't have access to, say, radio communication, but they would use systems like mounted couriers and sometimes signal fires to ensure that they had some amount of coordination across vast distances. Nomads grew up in environments requiring constant adaptability, such as herding or surviving in harsh climates, which translated naturally into combat scenarios. These traditions thus fostered a military culture of autonomy, adaptability, and rapid execution, making steppe armies some of the most formidable in history. There's a whole bunch of YouTube videos about Genghis Khan's military conquests and all that. Go ahead and watch one of them. That's great. Come back here after. Both the unit-based decision-making of modern militaries and the historical traditions of steppe warfare of the Mongols emphasized the ability to respond to changing battlefield conditions, with leaders at all levels entrusted to act without waiting for explicit orders in order to avoid delay. Both systems aim to reduce lag between learning new information, making a decision based on that information, and executing a new plan, thus maximizing combat effectiveness. For steppe nomads, autonomy was a natural extension of their way of life, while in modern militaries, autonomy is an institutional framework requiring training and doctrine. You can see the difference there with, for example, the Ukrainian military. It used to have more of a Russian-style top-down approach where you needed a general to make seemingly any decision. But then in between the first and second Russian invasion of their territory in the 21st century, they learned more NATO-style unit-based decision-making. Modern doctrine relies heavily on advanced communication and intelligence systems, whereas steppe warfare used only human skill and mastery of their environment. Pre-industrial armies, again, had no access to radio communications. And so modern forces are able to coordinate on a much larger scale. Steppe warfare, while highly effective, was limited by the size of the horsebound armies they used, and they had limited ability to relay information over especially long distances. Jaghatai Khan's preference for decentralized, highly mobile warfare thus, of course, mirrors the strengths of steppe nomadic traditions. That's the whole point of his legion. His ability to integrate these principles into the White Scars Legion thus allowed him to maintain flexibility and autonomy, setting his legion apart in an era where most others adhered to rigid, siege-oriented doctrines and set-piece battles. The White Scars' success demonstrates the timeless value of empowering individual units to make decisions, a principle as relevant for us on Earth as it was for the Mongols and as it was in fiction on the steppes of Chagoris. Now, let's talk about the Emperor's decisions when finding Jaghatai. We talked about timing a little bit, but that's just timing with regards to events on Chagoris. Overall, Jaghatai Khan was found quite late among the Primarchs. I wonder, did the Emperor demonstrate in his actions during that meeting that he'd learned any lessons from previous first meetings with Primarchs? I wonder, what can we learn about their emotional bond from their meeting? I think that by the time the Emperor arrived on Chagoris, he seemed more willing to acknowledge and respect the cultures his sons had embraced. Unlike the heavy-handed interventions with Lorgar and Angron and Mortarion, a couple others, the Emperor allowed Jaghatai to retain much of his steppe identity. Perhaps earlier missteps, like Angron's forced removal from his gladiatorial rebellion, had taught the Emperor the value of respecting a Primarch's autonomy as a person. Jaghatai was neither coerced explicitly or dismissed. Rather, he was treated as a peer. The Emperor, to some degree, engaged Jaghatai on his terms, recognizing the warrior ethos of the steppes and the Mongol similar values of honor, loyalty, and swift action. This understanding, and perhaps his own personal memory of the Mongols, helped him to forge a deeper connection than he had with more alienated sons like Perturabo. So, yes, while the Emperor often imposed his vision without regard for cultural nuance, he had proven with the examples of Leman Russ and Vulcan that he was willing to accept the traditions of cultures he encountered. So when he encountered Chagoris, his actions suggest that he understood that harmony rather than domination could build stronger bonds. The Emperor presented the Great Crusade not as an imposition, but as an opportunity for Jaghatai to pursue his own ideals on a grander scale. The Khan's love of freedom and his disdain for tyranny resonated with the Emperor's rhetoric about uniting humanity. Though, of course, Jaghatai understood it wasn't really a choice. He had to do it, and the Emperor had the force, in that case the Luna Wolves, to back it up. So yeah, unlike earlier encounters where the Emperor's purpose was framed as a distasteful duty, so notably Angron and Mortarion, on Chagoris, it was portrayed as a continuation of Jaghatai's personal mission. Thus, the Emperor and the Khan shared, at least in ideals, a disdain for oppression and a commitment to decisive action. This alignment of values thus allowed them to form an emotional connection based on mutual respect. Not the strongest of the Primarchs, but that's all right. The Emperor saw in Jaghatai a leader who could go into the Great Crusade without the complications of jealousy or resentment. He didn't see him as a son, which is an unfortunate overlooking, but whatever. Jaghatai was not a natural subordinate, but he respected those who earned his loyalty. The Emperor's approach showing up with the force to back up his ideas if he had turned to force. Didn't exactly do the best at this, but still, there was some amount of the emperor honoring his independence while offering a grander purpose. The Khan's later loyalty during the Horus Heresy suggests that this respect may have endured. The emperor's willingness to engage with Jaghatai on equal footing thus set their relationship apart from his often strained connections with other Primarchs. This mutual recognition thus laid the groundwork for a less contentious, more collaborative bond. So, had the emperor learned lessons? Yeah, I think so. The emperor demonstrated a greater willingness to approach Jaghatai with respect and understanding, avoiding the authoritarian impositions which had alienated other Primarchs, but also not perfectly. The meeting went well, but it's unclear if the emperor really internalized these lessons. Later failures, with him dismissing or ignoring the Primarch's emotional needs, ultimately leading to them falling during the heresy, suggest that his progress in building emotional bonds was inconsistent, or that he just viewed it as a tool among many, rather than being the most important tool when dealing with his sons. For Jaghatai, the meeting with the emperor was an opportunity to align his personal values with a larger cause. For the emperor, it was a rare moment of connection with a being whose outlook complemented his own. Their bond was not as emotionally intimate as with Horus or Sanguinius, but it was built on mutual respect and a shared disdain for tyranny, a foundation which, while not always lived out in the actual Imperium, was still an ideal which carried them through the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Thematically, the meeting serves as a reminder that even the most powerful relationships are forged through respect, understanding, and shared purpose. This was a lesson that the emperor should have applied more universally, and didn't. The next Primarch the emperor found was Conrad Kurz. Woof. That is rough. Kurz is the ultimate test case of how the emperor's inconsistency in dealing with his sons led to disaster. After the relatively smooth integration of Jaghatai Khan, the emperor must have been feeling good about it. Yeah, he's got this thing down. Bam! Meets with Kurz, a madman. The polar opposite. The meeting was fraught with miscommunication, emotional neglect, and an almost willful blindness to the psychological trauma Kurz had both endured and inflicted on Nostromo. Coming off the success of his meeting with Jaghatai, it must have seemed to the emperor and those around him that he was starting to refine his approach to his sons. But then when he was faced with someone as complex and damaged as Kurz, the emperor reverted to his more impersonal authoritarian tendencies and dipped immediately. Get me the fuck out of here. The emperor had successfully bonded with Jaghatai by respecting his culture and ideals. Kurz didn't just have a unique culture, he had trauma. He carried deep emotional scars from his upbringing, and the emperor's failure to even acknowledge this trauma, thus set the stage for alienation and ultimately rebellion. With the Khan, the emperor could afford to emphasize a grander purpose because the Khan was already aligned with his ideals. Kurz, shaped by a nihilistic worldview, caused this approach to fail utterly. Kurz needed validation, understanding, therapy, not just a place in the crusade. He needed to be fixed. He needed to be cured. He needed to at least be treated. He needed a hug before he could be put in charge of potentially killing billions of people. The emperor saw a warrior poet in Jaghatai, a part of himself that he really liked. But then when he saw Kurz, he saw a dangerous, uncontrollable force of destruction and cruelty, and he did not like the idea that that was a part of himself. This fear thus led him to adopt a more distant and authoritarian approach, which only exacerbated Kurz's paranoia, feelings of rejection, and downward spiral into insanity. The juxtaposition between the Emperor's success with Jaghatai and his immediately subsequent failure with Kurz thus highlights a key flaw in his character, his inability to adapt his approach consistently to the needs of his sons. The Emperor could be empathetic and inspiring, and there's a bunch of Primarchs that he was like that with, but he could also be dismissive and cold, as with Kurz, Mortarion, or Angron. This inconsistency thus sowed the seeds of the Horus heresy. It's almost tragic to imagine the Emperor, perhaps buoyed by his successful meeting with Jaghatai, walking onto Nostromo and encountering Kurz. He may have even hoped to replicate the meeting that he just had with Jaghatai, all about mutual respect, only to be met with the stark reality of Kurz's insane, cruel, violent worldview and Kurz's deep mistrust of authority. This timing underscores the Emperor's hubris. After succeeding with Jaghatai, he might have believed that his method he used there was universally effective, only to face the harsh truth that sometimes his sons needed more than just a vision of the crusade. They needed a father. I'm calm now. Okay, let's be a little charitable here. Maybe the Emperor and the Great Crusade had faced some setbacks, challenges, or losses in between finding Jaghatai Khan and finding Conrad Kurz. Maybe there were some stressors which put the Emperor off his step before meeting Kurz. Would that perhaps help to explain why Kurz was immediately placed in command of the Night Lords with no acclamation and a limited mentorship under Fulgrim? Exact chronology and stuff has never really been 40K's strong suit. And honestly, I think it's better when it's a little loosey-goosey. But from what I can find in canon, there were several notable actions in the Great Crusade that occurred between Jaghatai Khan being found in, I believe, 865.m30 and Conrad Kurz being found in, I believe, 896.m30. So first, very shortly after Jaghatai Khan was found, the White Scars Legion participated in the compliance on Molech. We'll get more into Molech when we talk about Horus, but it was important. And the Emperor securing Molech should have made him be a bit more certain that the project of the Imperium was going to be okay. Molech was the site of a warp gate through which beings could go directly to the realms of chaos to negotiate with the chaos gods to try to gain power. That was one option, the option used by Horus later, by which entities could gain sufficient power to threaten the survival of the Imperium. So, having taken that, he should have been a little more confident. That's a threat gone, right? There's a couple small events that happened which are still large enough to be recorded in occasional spots here and there. The compliance of Zavarich, the Majin Tor transgression, the crisis of the Hungering Gyre, the discovery of Lascal, the discovery of Grail. None of those are really great. Not super important. It wouldn't explain this difference in approach between Jaghatai Khan and Conrad Kurz. So what did, then? The Emperor's decision to immediately place Conrad Kurz in command of the Night Lords with almost no period of acclamation and a very short period of mentorship under Fulgrim suggests a significant shift in his approach, maybe due to a major stressor. Examining the period between his meeting with Jaghatai Khan and Conrad Kurs thus maybe explains why the emperor changed his priorities or his state of mind. Here's some broad trends. There is an increasing scope of the Great Crusade. By the time of Kurs's discovery, the Great Crusade had reached a scale where maintaining control and cohesion was becoming increasingly difficult. New threats from Xenos empires to internal rebellions taxed the emperor's resources and focus. This led the emperor to revert back to his earlier, simpler approach, perhaps, get each Primarch integrated quickly to keep the crusade moving. The process of integrating Primarchs like Angron and Mortarion into the Imperium had been fraught with difficulty. Angron's rebellion and refusal to abandon his gladiator brethren may have left the emperor disillusioned about how much effort he could invest in bonding with his sons. And the success of Jaghatai Khan being put into command with very little time spent bonding with him may have thus led him to believe that it wasn't really necessary to do that. Plus, in the main body of the Great Crusade, in the main major theaters of war, Horus was already proving himself as the emperor's most accomplished and trusted son. The emperor's growing reliance on Horus may have thus built a thought that he didn't need to personally mentor new Primarchs, and could instead just hand Primarchs off to their peers rather than handling it personally, like Vulcan being mentored by Ferrus Manus or Fulgrim being mentored by Horus. The Emperor's long-term goal of creating the Webway project may have been starting to show some successes in the background, thus being a source of hope for the Emperor, but also increasing burdens on him. Balancing the demands of the Crusade with the secretive development of the Webway may have left him with little patience for extensive acclimation periods for his sons. Primarchs like Perturabo and Lorgar were already showing cracks in their loyalty at this point, though the Emperor didn't really want to understand or believe that, because those issues had not yet come to a head, if I have the chronology right. The Emperor may have thus been preoccupied with containing or managing emerging problems, leaving less emotional bandwidth for handling Kurs. No, it has to be something bigger than all of those general trends, bigger than the smaller campaigns we mentioned earlier. The Rangdan Xenocides. If I understand the chronology right, the second and third Rangdan Xenocides occurred between finding Jaghatai Khan and finding Conrad Kurs. That explains everything. The Imperium was almost destroyed. The Dark Angels took so many casualties, as well as other legions. Given the incredible stressor of facing an existential threat from a massive Xenos empire, the Emperor may have approached Kurs's integration as a functional necessity, rather than a familial or personal endeavor. Nostromo's compliance under Kurs's iron-fisted rule may have reinforced the Emperor's belief that Kurs didn't need mentorship. He was already achieving results. Yes, they were distasteful results, but they were results. This decision thus reflects his growing tendency to treat the Primarchs as tools of conquest rather than sons. If the Emperor was being overburdened by responsibilities, and he viewed his sons as increasingly independent, it might thus explain his willingness to thrust Kurs into command without proper preparation. In hindsight, it is clear that this approach was disastrous. Kurs's lack of guidance compounded his paranoia and deepened his alienation. But understanding the pressures that the Emperor faced at the time helps contextualize his actions. Because of the Rangdan, the Emperor was focused on the macro scale of the Imperium's survival, and blinded by his belief in the Primarchs' inherent greatness and inherent capability. He underestimated Kurs's emotional instability and overestimated his ability to handle command, because he believed that he needed every Primarch on the front lines as soon as possible. This misstep was not a failure of empathy, it was also a failure of prioritization. The emperor can't really be said to have tried empathy with Kurs, so I'm not going to say he failed at it. But he tried to prioritize what was important, and he failed at it. On the subject of mentorship, back with the Khan. Jaghatai Khan did not have a formal mentor. He didn't serve alongside other Primarchs frequently, and he and the White Scars often fought independently, far from the main theaters of war of the Crusade. His position within the Great Crusade was thus unique, at least until Corax was found. His upbringing on the steppes and the distinct culture of the White Scars thus made the Emperor believe him, correctly, to be well suited to operating independently. But this independence then shaped his relationships with his brothers and his understanding of the Imperium as a whole. Jaghatai Khan was specifically not assigned a formal mentor after his discovery. Unlike Vulcan being mentored by Ferrus Manus, or Fulgrim spending time under Horus's guidance, or Kurs briefly mentored by Fulgrim, Jaghatai's integration was more self-directed. His skill set was already formed, and he immediately established the culture of his legion, meaning he thus needed less hands-on instruction. The Emperor trusted Jaghatai to act autonomously, particularly because of his demonstrated leadership on Chogoris, and he immediately thus showed an ability to bring worlds into compliance without requiring extensive resources or oversight. Interestingly, in some parts of canon, Gilliman and Dorn openly criticized the Emperor's decision to forego a period of acclimation, assimilation, and mentorship for the Khan. Now, the White Scars were noted for their preference for speed, mobility, and autonomy, often operating on the fringes of the Crusade, exploring what was out there. This tactical independence made it less common for him to serve alongside other Primarchs or their legions. But there are notable exceptions for his legion at Molech, Arco, and Droon. But further, several companies of the White Scars were often seconded to the Luna Wolves to serve under Horus's command, in effect serving as mobile fast attack force alongside the more static Luna Wolves. When he did fight along others, it was often in joint campaigns where their strengths complemented one another. Most notably, on Ulanor, Jaghatai's speed and the flexibility of the White Scars played a crucial role in Horus's coordination of the victory. Now, though their methods and philosophies clashed, Jaghatai did occasionally fight alongside Mortarion, highlighting the tensions between Jaghatai's fluid tactics and Mortarion's attritional approach. But these alliances were often brief. The White Scars preferred to strike out on their own and pursue compliance missions and exploration in remote regions of the galaxy. Now, regarding Jaghatai's emotional understanding of acting independently and being seen as somewhat different and on the fringe, there are some mentions in canon of Jaghatai forming friendship with Magnus about being seen as different from others and acting independently. I don't find any explicit record of conversations between Jaghatai and Corax, even though thematic parallels suggest that they may have had common ground once Corax was found. Both of them valued self-reliance and were shaped by their homeworld cultures. Corax's tactics, shaped by secrecy and subterfuge, pointed him in the direction of operating independently of the main body of the Crusade, just as how Jaghatai's mobility warfare and independence pointed him towards independent operation as well. If they discussed their experiences, it would have been good for them. They would have been able to talk about how they balanced independence with the broader needs of the Crusade, as contrasted with, say, Lionel Johnson. The Dark Angels also often fought independently, but his secrecy and unwillingness to share his plans may have thus clashed with the Khan's more straightforward nature. Jaghatai's autonomy and independence fostered both in himself and in the White Scars Legion a continuing self-reliance and adaptability. They operated far from the main theaters of war, the main body of the Great Crusade. But that meant that he was often misunderstood or overlooked by his brothers. He was distant from imperial politics. Perhaps that goes some distant towards explaining why he didn't speak up as the face of the librarian project at the council at Nicaea. His time spent on the outskirts of the galaxy thus gave him a broader view of the Imperium's flaws and the need for balance between central authority and cultural autonomy. Jaghatai Khan's relationships with his fellow Primarchs were shaped by his reserved nature, his independent spirit, the unique culture of the White Scars, and the frequent vast physical separation between the White Scars and the main body of the Crusade. While he was not known for being especially close to his brothers with the exception of Magnus, the interactions he did have reveal much about his values and the dynamics among the Primarchs. With Horus Lupercal, the Khan had a respect for him, tinged with skepticism. Jaghatai admired Horus's charisma and military prowess, and often seconded several companies of the White Scars to fight alongside the Luna Wolves, as mentioned before, serving as a mobile, fast attack force to complement the more traditional combined arms approach of the Luna Wolves. Horus's ability to unite and lead others as being impressive. That sentence got away from me. Whatever. But Jaghatai was among those who saw his ambition and his promotion to War Master as dangerous. This wariness became critical during the Horus Heresy, as Jaghatai's sense of honor and independence made him resistant to Horus's overtures. We mentioned Magnus the Red already, with whom Jaghatai had an intellectual respect, shared curiosity, and a shared feeling of being alone. Both of them shared a love of knowledge, and they bonded over their outsider status, even though their approaches differed. And Magnus's deep engagement with psychic knowledge worked well with Jaghatai's respect for the Storm Seer traditions of Chogoris and the White Scars' more tightly controlled use of librarians. Jaghatai's appreciation for philosophy and their ability to bond over their similar outsider status thus led to a warm friendship and deep conversations, sometimes, despite the frequent vast spatial distance between their legions. Now, though they did occasionally fight alongside each other, Jaghatai Khan had a poor relationship with Mortarion. His focus on mobility, freedom, and his willingness to use librarians clashed with Mortarion's slower attritional strategies and his rigid worldview, which demanded the execution of all psychers. Their personalities and values were fundamentally at odds, creating an underlying friction. Both the Khan and Sanguinius were idealists in their own way, and Khan admired Sanguinius's nobility and vision for uplifting humanity. They were not especially close, due in large part to vast spatial separation between their legions, but their shared sense of purpose fostered mutual respect. The Khan's reserved nature and preference for autonomy often kept him at a distance from his brothers, but he rarely expressed open hostility. He built relationships based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than emotional closeness. This pragmatism made the Khan a reliable ally, but it limited his deeper connections. And Khan's strong sense of honor and individuality made him more resistant to attempts by Horus to sway him through charisma. His relationships with his brothers thus reveal a need for respect, authenticity, and alignment of values. While he did not seek close bonds, he did value those bonds which occurred. He valued those brothers who shared his ideals and at least respected his perspective. His ability to navigate these relationships without compromising his values thus speaks to his emotional strength and self-assurance. I wonder what opportunities for friendship with other Primarchs may have been good options for Jaghatai Khan. With his philosophical nature, respect for individuality, and love of freedom, the Khan often stood apart from his brothers in personality and perspective. But these traits also meant that certain Primarchs, either through shared ideals or complementary qualities, could have been excellent candidates for meaningful friendships. Such relationships might have thus helped Khan to feel less isolated, while enriching his outlook and reinforcing his role within the Imperium. We spoke earlier about Sanguinius, the empathetic visionary. Both Khan and Sanguinius shared a philosophical and introspective nature. They were idealists. They had a love of beauty, and they believed that their higher ideals could exhibit themselves even within the Imperium. Sanguinius's emotional intelligence could have thus complemented Jaghatai Khan's quieter, more reserved demeanor, creating a bond of mutual respect. Perhaps Sanguinius might have helped Khan to feel more connected to his brothers and the larger purpose of the Imperium, reducing his sense of detachment, had they made more of a mutual effort to spend more time together. Perhaps Vulcan may have been a good option. Vulcan's deep empathy and dedication to humanity would have resonated with the Khan's own respect for individual worth and autonomy. Both of these Primarchs valued practicality and action over rigid bureaucracy, and their shared focus on protecting humanity might have created common ground. Perhaps Vulcan's warmth and open-hearted nature might have helped Khan to feel more at ease, fostering a genuine friendship. They might have bonded over efforts to protect the Imperium's people through campaigns to defend frontier worlds, perhaps. Maybe Vulcan might have encouraged the Khan to take a more active role in shaping the Imperium's domestic policies and overall direction, thus balancing his love of freedom with the need to make an impact on the broader scale. I feel that Corax would have been a good choice. They had a kindred rebellious spirit. They both shared a disdain for authoritarianism and a deep respect for the rights and dignity of individuals, thus leading them to take their legions far away from the main body of the Great Crusade to fight on the frontier, where they could more easily ignore the blatant hypocrisies and authoritarianism of the Imperium. Both of them had an outsider's perspective within the Primarchs, preferring to operate on the fringes rather than at its core because of it. Their shared love of unorthodox tactics might have created a sense of camaraderie. Perhaps the two might have been able to even work together on campaigns out on the fringes, which required both of their legions' tactics and specialties. Maybe they may have been able to speak in deep conversations about the Imperium's purpose, the challenges of leadership, and the difficulty in dealing with an Imperium which falls short of their ideals. Maybe even Fulgrim might have been an interesting choice, though, given how often Fulgrim led his legion in the main theaters of the conflicts in the Great Crusade, they would not have had very many opportunities to meet, just due to physical spatial separation. Fulgrim's vanity and obsession with perfection might seem at odds with the Khan's pragmatism, but their shared appreciation for artistry and creativity might have forged an unexpected connection, much like Fulgrim forming a friendship with Ferrus Manus. Fulgrim's drive to elevate humanity's cultural achievements might have resonated with the Khan's belief in the importance of individuality and self-expression. Perhaps the two might have collaborated on projects blending art and practicality. Fulgrim may have admired Khan's unique leadership style had he worked together with him on a campaign, and perhaps the Khan might have tempered Fulgrim's aesthetic excesses with a more grounded perspective. There were also some Primarchs who might struggle to bond with Jaghatai Khan, even if Khan would have been able to perhaps help some of them. Leman Russ, his boisterous and confrontational nature, may have clashed with the Khan's quieter, more reflective personality. Further, Jaghatai resented the White Scars being judged to be frenzied barbarians due to their cultural trappings, leading him to perhaps distance his legion from the Space Wolves, lest the reputation deepen. Perturabo was a huge asshole all the time, with a personality like rubbing a cheese grater across your face. And Conrad Kurs was a madman. Everyone wanted to stay the fuck away from him. Maybe even Angron. Same thing as Kurs, but a different flavor of madness. With Perturabo, or Conrad Kurs, or Angron, maybe spending time with Jaghatai Khan might have been able to improve them, make them less terrible. But that's a hard thing to ask of the Khan. Jaghatai had key themes for Jaghatai's friendships, which were not met by any of those three assholes. He shared respect for autonomy. He bonded best with brothers who valued individuality and freedom, like Magnus. He had a philosophical and intellectual connection with Sanguinius and Magnus, providing the Khan with opportunities for deep discussions and mutual growth. His adaptability and practical skills would make him an excellent partner for shared campaigns for those Primarchs who shared ideals with him about what the Imperium was for. So, for sure, not Kurs. Jaghatai Khan's friendship with Magnus was based on shared ideals. Perhaps then he may have been able to form other friendships similarly. Deepening a friendship with Sanguinius or establishing friendships with Vulcan or Corax may have perhaps offered the best opportunities for meaningful connections for him, as they could have thus complemented Khan's values while helping him to feel less isolated. These relationships might have thus drawn Khan further into the Imperium's inner workings, balancing his love of exploration with a stronger sense of belonging. What can we learn about Jaghatai Khan's character from his period of early interstellar leadership? As with all of the Primarchs, their early time shaping their legion in their image highlights the Primarchs' values, leadership style, and the complex interplay between their cultural heritage from their homeworld and their role within the Imperium. Despite inheriting a legion, the Pioneers, that had developed its own traditions and its own various problems in his absence, Jaghatai Khan demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt by uniting the White Scars, instilling his philosophy of mobility, freedom, adaptability, and getting everyone on board with adopting Chogoris and its culture as their new home world. His ability to thus synthesize disparate traditions into a cohesive whole reflects his capacity to balance his own idealism with the practical needs necessary to put it into practice. Jaghatai's leadership style emphasized interdependence between companies, but also unit-level decision-making. encouraging his officers and warriors to act independently within the overarching vision. This mirrored his own need for freedom, stemming from his upbringing on the steppes. He thrived when he could act without constraint, and he sought to create a legion that operated in a similar way, but without suffering the problems of the pioneer companies from before he had inherited the legion, where everyone was all spread out on their own, not working together. Jaghatai's actions in leading the White Scars reflect his commitment to fairness and mutual respect. He sought to be a leader that his warriors could admire and trust, not just obey, and certainly not fear like, Kurz or Angron. Bertarabo. His decision to focus on rapid strikes and hit-and-run attacks when possible, in order to wear down a larger foe, to allow a smaller force to defeat a greater force, suggests a preference for efficacy and efficiency over brute force, along with the value of preserving the lives of his men where possible. Like all Primarchs, Jaghatai craved validation. However, he, most among the Primarchs, was comfortable receiving that validation from within his own legion, rather than needing it to be top-down from the Emperor or laterally from another Primarch. He sought to demonstrate the value of his philosophy and tactics rather than forcing conformity to a rigid mold, and having thus earned the respect of his legion, he was comfortable being validated by that respect. He needed his approach to be recognized as legitimate, and this was a bit difficult, given that his legion gained a reputation as like savages or barbarians among the wider Imperium, but it wasn't absolutely necessary to him that anyone outside of the legion viewed him the way that his own legion viewed him. Jaghatai's efforts to foster a sense of brotherhood within the White Scars were the important part. He needed genuine connections. His warriors were not just tools for conquest, they were his family. This stems from his experiences on Chagoris, of course, where loyalty to one's tribe and leader were paramount. His penchant for independent operations, exploring on the fringes of the Great Crusade, suggest a deep-seated need for freedom and exploration, both physical and intellectual, thus informing his leadership and tactics, allowing the White Scars to operate with effectiveness in mobile warfare and with autonomy outside of the main theaters of the Great Crusade. There were, of course, challenges. Jaghatai Khan and the White Scars most often operated far from the main body of the crusade, thus limiting his contact with other Primarchs and with the Emperor. In many other Primarchs, this would have exacerbated feelings of isolation, but Jaghatai instead embraced it, channeling his independence into strength. The alternative was the pressure to conform within the main Imperium. The Imperium's rigid structures clashed with Jaghatai's more fluid and individualistic approach. When he had contact with the Imperium, he was required to constantly justify and prove the efficacy of his methods due to the politics of it all. His success in doing so shows us his determination to stay true to his values, but he didn't exactly like having to do that. He was out on the fringes specifically to stay away from the politics of it all and do what he thought was best. This shows us a broader implication for his character later. As the Horus Heresy was approaching, Jaghatai and some members of the White Scars became concerned that as they ran out of Galaxy to explore, they would have to change in order to conform to the main part of the Imperium, thus losing part of who they were. As it turns out, that didn't come to pass because the heresy happened, but whatever. Overall, Jaghatai's early interstellar leadership solidifies his identity as an idealist who valued freedom, loyalty, and mobility. He was not one to be bound by the traditions of others for their own sakes, but he deeply respected the traditions that aligned with his values, those of his home world. His emotional needs thus shaped his leadership style and the unique culture of the White Scars. We can see that his emotional needs were deeply tied to his identity as a wanderer, philosopher, and protector of his people. He had a unique perspective, at least until Korax was found, on freedom, loyalty, and the nature of the Imperium. He really needed the ability to operate independently and lead his legion without excessive oversight. He needed the space to govern and fight in his own way, thus reflecting the nomadic traditions of Chogoris. Any attempts to restrict his methods or impose rigid constraints clashed with his deeply ingrained sense of personal and cultural freedom. Thus, when he fought alongside other legions at big conflicts, like we'll talk about later, his legion more or less just got called back, fought in the one thing, and then fucked off back to the fringes. We can see this perhaps as an attempt by the Khan to maintain a strong connection to his roots on Chogoris, his emotional well-being being tied to his ability to preserve the essence of his homeland in his legion and in his heart, even as he adapted to the wider Imperium, as was needed. Now, yes, he was perceived as a warrior and a hunter, and by those outside the Legion, a savage, but he was a contemplative thinker with a keen understanding of the balance between order and chaos. He needed recognition for his intellect and insight in addition to his martial prowess, and he got that recognition from Magnus and from his legion, and that was enough for him. Jaghatai valued loyalty as a bond of respect rather than coercion. He wanted to feel that his service to the Emperor was a choice born out of mutual respect rather than an obligation or an enforced subservience, as with, say, Mortarion or Angron. This thus extended to his relationship with his legion. He sought to inspire loyalty through shared ideals rather than fear or domination. Again, Angron, Kors, Perturabo. He was not like them, and he wanted to not be like them. Jaghatai needed the thrill of exploration and the chance to face new challenges. If he had suffered by being assigned repetitive tasks, long sieges, garrison duties, it would have been awful for him. The Crusade's expansive nature gave him some natural outlets for this exploratory drive of his. But this desire for autonomy thus led him to be physically detached and thus emotionally detached from his fellow Primarchs. Many of them valued rigid hierarchy or collective strategy, but his isolation thus could lead him to alienation due to his differences from them. Now, not just the Primarchs, the Imperium's centralized and authoritarian structure clashed with Jaghatai's values, causing friction between his ideals and his obligations. He could deal with that dichotomy within himself, but only if he was physically separated from the obvious hypocrisies. But then his resistance to strict conformity made him less involved in the political and administrative aspects of the Imperium, thus diminishing his influence on its development, which was a big loss. He could have done a great deal for the Imperium if he had had greater recognition of and respect for the traditions of Chogoris by the Emperor and his brothers. Perhaps that might have strengthened Jaghatai's connection to the Imperium. Assigning Jaghatai duties that allowed for freedom of movement, exploration, and for him to make his own choices on his own initiative, aligned with his strengths and needs. He needed to avoid the fate of the Iron Warriors, being assigned the worst jobs that no one else wanted and being stuck doing them for decade after decade. Jaghatai also needed to be able to speak about deep matters with his brother, Magnus. Maybe some of the others would have been nice also. This made him feel more integrated into the Imperium's broader purpose because he could speak about the general philosophy of it and his own outsider status with someone who understood. His unique perspective and values offered a vital counterbalance to the rigidity of the Imperium. And had he been more valued and validated and publicly celebrated by his brothers or the Emperor, perhaps it might have fostered even greater harmony within the Crusade, but also put the Imperium on a bit more of a freedom-loving path rather than an innately authoritarian one that just kept screwing itself tighter. Now, let's talk a little more about the White Scars. The transition of the Legion when they met Jaghatai Khan reshaped their culture, tactics, and identity, but also introduced some internal tension as existing traditions and command structures were challenged by the Primarch's ethos. As with all of the legions, the Astartes of the previously called pioneer companies and stuff, the 5th Legion, regarded their Primarch as a near-divine figure. His charisma and martial prowess inspired immediate respect, and the White Scars, who had not enjoyed their position within the Great Crusade before, embraced his leadership wholeheartedly. They had had long years of estrangement from other imperial forces, suffering high casualties out in the margins as the pioneer companies. But his arrival and his bringing them together to unify them gave them purpose and an identity that they didn't have before. The Legion had developed some of its own traditions in the absence of their Primarch, reflecting their origins on Terra and the broader imperial military doctrines of the Great Crusade, but they had also been separated from each other. So they didn't really have one big counterbalancing culture to set up as an alternative to that of their Primarch, like, say, the World Leaders. Instead, they gleefully grabbed onto the option of having a unified Legion culture. And so, with Jaghatai, they were introduced to the philosophy of the steps: mobility, freedom, adaptability, unit-based decision-making. This marked a departure from their existing approach, and they were happy to be brought together and remade. At first, culturally on the fields of Chagoris, and then later in battle at the Killarney Circle. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Tai, of course, fostered a sense of brotherhood among his warriors, emphasizing bonds of loyalty and shared purpose in order to unify the Legion. Unlike some Primarchs, again, Angron, Kors, Perturabo, who ruled with an iron fist, Jaghatai's leadership style encouraged mutual respect, which helped mitigate any potential factionalism within the Legion. Even as he promoted those within his own inner circle from Chagoris, from the wars on the steppes, into leadership roles in the White Scars in order to teach them his ways of war. The transformation of the Legion into the White Scars mirrors in some ways Vulcan's influence on the Salamanders, where the Primarch's homeworld culture deeply reshapes the Legion, but the changes were arguably more radical given the tactical and philosophical shifts that he introduced. Jaghatai's arrival transformed the 5th Legion from the disparate pioneer companies of scouts into a unified force, the Imperium's premier mobile warfare specialists. Their success in this role and their deep loyalty to their Primarch ensured that any early tensions or resistance within the Legion were smoothed over. The White Scars, after the Killarney Circle campaign, were a family united by shared ideals, a deep respect for their leader, and the bonds forged in the fire of battle. They were thus one of the most cohesive of the legions throughout the Great Crusade. Jaghatai Khan's deeds and those of his legion throughout the Great Crusade reveal a great deal about the Khan's character, leadership style, and values. His actions throughout that period show us his tactical brilliance and his philosophical depth, as well as his ability to balance independence and autonomy with loyalty to the emperor and to the imperium. When he first met the White Scars, he called the disparate pioneer companies together, and upon reuniting with his legion, he solidified his leadership over them by integrating their culture with that of Chogoris. He demonstrated a keen understanding of politics and culture, forging a cohesive society from a legion unknown to him, which lacked a cohesive identity before him, thus allowing a culture to which new recruits from his homeworld would not face a fierce culture shock as they may have if they had been initially faced with exclusively Terran origin Marines. Khan reshaped the White Scars, instilling the traditions of Chogoris into the Legion, with an emphasis on speed, maneuverability, and most importantly, the explorer, warrior ethos of the steppes. He thus maintained a strong connection to his heritage, using it to inspire his warriors. With ritual scarification, thus the name, the White Scars, that's the name. Anyway, and their taking of new names, symbolizing their acceptance of their adoptive homeworld. The new names were originally each Terran origin Marine referring some deed that they had done or some talent they had. But then later recruits generally took names more related to Chogoris itself. So there was a gradually emerging dynamic. It wasn't just all at once. Khan understood the importance of imbuing his legion with a unifying identity, and he did so really well, ensuring their loyalty and morale even in the darkest days of the crusade. After that, Jaghatai Khan took his newly inducted recruits from Chogoris, his Keshig, who had fought alongside him on Chogoris and learned his ways of war, and he distributed them among the rest of the White Scars, with directions to teach the lessons of the Khan to the rest of the Legion. For a real-life comparison, we might use the example of Baron von Steuben, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in the American Revolutionary War at Valley Forge, who trained the so-called Model Company, and then used each person from the Model Company to train the rest of the Continental Army. The systems of the Killarney Circle had already been scouted and found to be infested with human mutants and various species of Xenos. So the White Scars conducted lightning-fast campaigns across the Circle, focusing on hit-and-run tactics, precision strikes, and the liberation of those pure human populations among the Circle. These campaigns were marked by their effectiveness and relentless pursuit of victory, showcasing the Khan's ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies. Thus, Jaghatai Khan, newly introduced to the Imperium and with no period of formal mentorship, led his legion as an unified force against the terrible enemies of the Killarney Circle, in order for the various companies of the White Scars, previously separated from each other, to learn how to fight as a unified legion, with companies depending on each other, fighting using the hit-and-run tactics that he was teaching them through his Keshig. The companies of the White Scars, the pioneer companies, had previously been fighting mostly independently and scattered across wide swaths of space, kind of like how the Dark Angels were before being united with Lionel Johnson. Anyway, according to the canon I've found, the White Scars numbered roughly 80,000 before that campaign, and then lost around 10,000 during the conflicts at the Killarney Circle. A substantial loss, which was still far less than it would have been without the use of the techniques of mobility warfare he taught them. This all proved to be worth it, as he followed the war by recruiting heavily from among those untainted humans of the Circle brought into compliance by the White Scars. Afterwards, Of note, there were, I think, 3 big multi-legion conflicts of the Great Crusade described in canon, in which the White Scars participated. The White Scars mostly fought by themselves off on the outskirts of the Imperium, exploring and fighting independently far from the main theaters of the Great Crusade. But they did notably fight alongside other legions at Arco and Droon. Wait, hold on. Four. They fought along other legions at Arco and Droon and Molech. There we go. We'll talk more about Droon when we get into the council at Nicaea much later, probably during the Magnus section. The last of the big conflicts they fought in like a big multi-legion sort of way during the Great Crusade was, of course, the Ulanor campaign against the Orc horde of Urlak Urg, just before Horus was promoted to War Master. Khan often led his legion operating independently and autonomously, exploring far from the main theaters of the Great Crusade, choosing his targets and methods without direct oversight. He thus occasionally clashed with imperial authorities who sought to impose more rigid control, accountability, feedback, reports, that sort of thing. While loyal to the emperor, he valued autonomy and resisted micromanagement. And both due to the political weight that he wielded as a Primarch and due to the physical separation making it more difficult for anyone to actually punish him if they wanted to, he was able to do what he liked. This defiance was rooted in principle, not rebellion. He acted in ways that he believed best served the Imperium, even if it meant bending the rules. We can see this partly in his embrace of the librarian system in his legion. As a result of this, his legion was subjected by his political enemies to a whisper campaign, describing them as being barbarians and savages akin to the World Eaters or Space Wolves. This is quite incorrect. The legion were philosophers, but yes, they did enjoy their success in battle. Despite his aloofness, Khan earned respect for his martial prowess and strategic acumen. He was known to fight with honor and avoid unnecessary cruelty, thus setting him apart from the likes of, for example, the World Eaters. He was wont to offer human enemies the opportunity to surrender and join the Imperium, like how he had made that offer to so many back on Chagorissa, and like how he himself had chosen to join the Imperium rather than fight against the Emperor. Khan thus had a noble warrior ethos, a commitment to honorable combat and fair treatment of foes. This underscores his moral compass as a military leader. He chose to form bonds based off of mutual respect, valuing quality over quantity of time in his interactions. So he got along great with Magnus. Now, there's a myth here that backs up some of this. The White Scars tell a story to each other about Jaghatai Khan facing an enemy called the Pale Emperor, who refused to surrender and killed the emissaries sent to him, thus leading him to suffer the full weight of the wrath of the Khan. This can be seen as the Legion telling themselves how just and right they are for offering surrender to their enemies. We can see generally throughout the Great Crusade Jaghatai's continued emphasis on mobility, autonomy, his belief in the importance of freedom, both for himself and for the people under his protection, an ability to balance tradition with innovation, allowing him to lead effectively in diverse and challenging environments. Even the best acclimated, best mentored Primarch met enemies and met situations out in the galaxy which the Imperium had never encountered before. So all of the Primarchs had to develop the ability to adapt to new stuff. But Khan consistently demonstrated a commitment to fairness in these explorations. He rejected unnecessary brutality, not only as a way to distance his legion from the likes of the World Eaters, but partially for that reason. He thus remained steadfastly loyal to the Emperor throughout the Great Crusade, while maintaining his independence, thus a nuanced form of devotion to the Imperium. What this tells us about his emotional needs are thus that he was a man deeply driven by a need for respect, freedom, purpose, and autonomy. He thrived when he could choose the ability to chart his own course, and he struggled when faced with attempts to confine or control him, or to define who he was. His loyalty to the Emperor and to the Imperium was not blind obedience, but rather the respect of shared ideals, reinforcing his alignment with a greater vision. This, of course, put him in an unusual situation among the Primarchs, because he was so physically distant from everyone else in the crusade. So how did the Emperor and the Custodes act and think towards the White Scars and Jaghatai Khan? Well, that changed over time. Their perspectives evolved as the Great Crusade unfolded, and then as the events of the Horus Heresy brought the qualities of the White Scars into sharper focus. The Emperor admired Jaghatai's effectiveness as a leader, and his ability to swiftly pacify newly found regions through precision strikes and mobility warfare. The Khan's focus on harmony and cultural respect aligned in part with the Emperor's goal of bringing disparate human populations into compliance, and with one of the higher ideals of the Imperium, of allowing individual worlds to have their own culture, making up a tapestry in the Imperium, rather than having a monolithic culture imposed upon them. The White Scars' Mongolian-inspired warrior traditions and their adherence to a strict code of honor stood out among the Legion. The Emperor did not share their reverence for personal freedom. He was, of course, a dictator, but he recognized its utility in fostering loyalty within their legion, and he may have well remembered the Mongol hordes. Now, Jaghatai Khan's autonomy prompted some early concerns. Operating so far from the core of the crusade and showing limited interest in centralized politics made them appear unpredictable or risky. You couldn't tell their loyalty from talking to them. They were too far away. You had to rely on reports coming back about their successes. The Custodes, of course, who adhered rigidly to the Emperor's vision and authority with his direct oversight, found their individuality to be potentially at odds with imperial uniformity and oversight. But they were consummate warriors, so they respected the White Scars' speed and tactical acumen, as well as they respected any other of the Astartes. But generally, the Custodes viewed themselves as the Emperor's eyes and ears, and so when they weren't able to directly oversee the White Scars, they got nervous. As the White Scars demonstrated their ability to deliver results in compliance campaigns, initial doubts about their methods were thus tempered by respect for their success. Lorgar had been a Primarch who led his legion independently in an autonomous manner, kind of separated from the rest of the Great Crusade. And he was shown to be doing bad stuff so far as the Custodes were concerned. But that was demonstrated by slowness in their campaigning. The White Scars' frequent operations on the galactic fringe meant fewer direct interactions with the Emperor and Custodes, compared to legions operating closer to the main body of the crusade, and thus less oversight, as well as the Khan's disinterest in imperial politics and refusal to fully integrate into the rigid structure of the Imperium. But even though all that may have caused frustration with the Custodes, they didn't worry like they had with Lorgar, because they were behaving in a successful manner. They were bringing in world after world. They were pursuing their own preferred campaigns instead of being told, hey, go here, fight this enemy. But it was successful. Now, during the Horus Heresy, their autonomy was validated. Their decision to remain loyal during the heresy and returned to Terra immediately at the command of Dorn, or request of Dorn, whatever, validated the trust that the Emperor had in their honor and independent justice. They played a crucial role in the Battle of Terra, taking the Lionsgate spaceport through their grand success in mobility, and thus the Custodes came to view the White Scars as indispensable allies during the siege of the Imperial Palace. Despite their differences, the Custodes recognized that the Khan's ability to operate independently was vital during a time in which centralized command was sometimes fracturing. Dorn couldn't handle the whole war effort on his own, and the Emperor was busy in the webway. When the Khan was able to take the spaceport on his own, it was a great success. Now, there are some key moments in which the views can be seen to change. In the Chondax campaign, the White Scars campaign against the Orcs in the Chondax system following the Ulanor triumph, the Emperor was content to have a hands-off approach. Regardless of any wariness of any signs of dissent which the Custodes may have had, the post-Ulanor period was marked by a dramatic withdrawal of the Custodes from the galactic stage, as both they and the Emperor returned to Terra. Following the treason at Istvan, Jaghatai's choice to prioritize Terra over leading his own war, perhaps leading hit-and-run attacks against the traitors, solidified the Emperor's confidence in his loyalty. They were not just aloof warriors doing what they liked. They were critical defenders of the Imperium, who knew when to put aside what they wanted to do and do what needed to be done. The Emperor's respect for Jaghatai's contributions were thus secured by the Khan's performance during the Siege of Terra, and the White Scars' ability to act decisively during times of chaos. The Emperor, of course, was relegated to the Golden Throne at the end of the Horus Heresy, but the Custodes remained. After the heresy, during the Scouring, the Custodes saw the White Scars as embodying a valuable mix of loyalty and autonomy. It was a rare combination that allowed them to operate effectively in the fractured galaxy without having to wait for the Imperial Regent, Guilliman, to tell them what to do. They were indispensable in forcing the heretics into the Eye of Terror. In sum, the Emperor and the Custodes thus evolved from wary observers of Jaghatai and his legion to recognizing them as indispensable allies. The White Scars' autonomy was originally a source of unease, but then ultimately proved to be a strength in both the Crusade and the Heresy and the Scouring, thus reshaping the Imperium's view of the role of the White Scars. But that brings us to an interesting question. What value might a Custodes advisor have brought to their efforts so far from the Emperor and the main theaters of conflict? And what value to the Emperor and Imperial institutions may have been gained from having an independent observer, a custodian, with the White Scars? A Custodes advisor may have been able to provide insights into the Emperor's strategic goals and broader galactic priorities, thus helping to align the White Scars' actions with the overarching Crusade's strategic needs. Jaghatai valued autonomy, but having a custodian to clarify the Emperor's long-term vision and the strategic priorities of the Great Crusade might have deepened his understanding of how his actions contributed to the Imperium's stability, thus allowing him to make more informed decisions while still leaving the choice his own. The Custodes held a unique position as absolute authority, being the Emperor's direct agents. Their presence, their political weight, could thus facilitate smoother coordination between the White Scars and other Imperial institutions. especially in remote regions where communication delays might lead to misunderstandings. Perhaps this might have allowed for faster resupply and reinforcement whenever the White Scars asked for it. Further, the custodians served as interpreters of the emperor's will, kind of a secular priesthood. A custodian advisor might thus have been able to use their political weight to temper potential misunderstandings and friction between the White Scars and more rigid imperial authorities, such as the Administratum and Munitorum. Those authorities saw the Khan's methods as unorthodox, so they didn't like him, and they engaged in a whisper campaign about him. But if a custodian had said, hey, help out the White Scars, they would have tripped over themselves to help. Now, the Custodes were not a part of the legions, of course. They were neutral observers. Neutral among the legions, I mean. They were loyal to the emperor directly, not to any one legion among another. A custodian with the White Scars might have thus been able to report directly to the emperor, offering an unique perspective on their campaigns, their morale, and their effectiveness without the bias of legion loyalty. The emperor, a distant figure, may have thus been able to gain valuable insights into Jaghatai's leadership and values, and thus been able to come up with ideas about their long-term trajectory and their value to the Imperium. This understanding might have thus informed decisions about how best to utilize the White Scars, and how to integrate their Primarch with broader imperial apparatus. Apparati? Whatever. Jaghatai's tendency to allow cultures to flourish on their own post-compliance might have raised questions among imperial bureaucrats, but a custodian might have thus been able to reassure the emperor and imperial institutions that the Khan's approach was effective and in line with the Imperium's goals. After all, it wasn't that far off from how Horus, the most beloved of the emperor's sons with the most political weight, operated, engaging with the individual cultures of worlds he wanted to bring into compliance, and having those worlds then maintain much of their culture post-compliance. There are some challenges, though. The Custodes' rigid adherence to the emperor's authority might have clashed with the Khan's fiercely independent mindset, and he might have viewed a custodian's presence as a subtle attempt to curtail his autonomy. But both the Khan and the Custodes were warriors par excellence, so they might have been able to appreciate each other's martial prowess and their dedication to the emperor and Imperium. A custodian who demonstrated respect for the Khan's methods and culture, and who fought alongside the White Scars, thus showing his martial ability, would have earned the trust of the Khan. Both of them sought to fulfill the emperor's vision, just in different ways. Their alignment in purpose may have been able to override any initial friction. Jaghatai was known to foster unexpected friendships, such as with Magnus during the Great Crusade, and I think he was friends with Nathaniel Garo during the Scouring, but I'm having trouble finding the source on that one. I think I've read it somewhere. But anyway, if the custodian had thus shown at least some humility instead of the massive arrogance that they were known for, then perhaps Jaghatai Khan might have welcomed a custodian as an honored companion, helping to bridge the gap between the White Scars' independent operations and their need for resupply and reinforcement from the Imperium's centralized operations, thus benefiting both parties. Any such successful bond between the Khan and a custodian advisor would thus have served to strengthen the White Scars' connection to the broader Imperium and enhance the understanding that the Emperor and the Imperium had of his enigmatic son. What were the reasons for Jaghatai Khan's strength of loyalty? And what fault lines in his personality and unmet emotional needs might have pointed him towards rebellion? I think we can see Jaghatai Khan's loyalty to the emperor and the Imperium as being rooted in a combination of personal philosophy, cultural values, and the circumstances of his life. There was philosophical alignment between the Khan and with some of the higher ideals of the Imperium. He valued freedom, and he understood the necessity and usefulness of unity. Words are hard. Necessity of unity and unification to protect and uplift humanity. The Emperor's vision of a unified galaxy thus resonated with his ideals, even though the means were imperfect. The Khan's disdain for tyranny and his personal honor made him fundamentally opposed to chaos, even though he didn't know what it was for quite a long time. The forces of the warp, thriving on deceit and destruction, were antithetical to his worldview. The nomadic traditions of the steppes emphasized loyalty to the tribe or khanate, mutual respect, and a warrior's code of honor. These cultural foundations, these cultural values, translated well into his relationship with the Imperium. The steppes fostered personal accountability and leadership, a trait which made him view rebellion as an abdication of duty. And Jaghatai recognized the emperor when he met him as an unique and unparalleled leader whose vision for humanity transcended even his own understanding. Thus, though the emperor's approach was quite rigid, his respect for the Khan's independence, as shown in their initial meeting, helped to foster trust and loyalty. The White Scars' operational independence, their physical separation from the main body of the crusade, meant that they were less exposed to the toxic politics that plagued other legions, and meant that they were not exposed to the specific corruption of the word bearers, who, of course, were responsible for the corruption of Horus. Operating on the frontier of the crusade thus allowed Jaghatai and his legion to maintain their focus on the ideals of liberation and progress, rather than on the internal strife of the Imperium. Now, despite these sources of loyalty, there were aspects of Jaghatai Khan's personality and emotional needs which may have made him susceptible to rebellion under different circumstances. The Khan's independent streak clashed with the Imperium's rigid bureaucracy and hierarchical structure. If he had been pushed too far by overbearing oversight, if he had been forced into campaigns not of his choice, which put his legion under immense stress, he might have become disillusioned. The Khan needed respect for his autonomy and his methods. Without that, he might have felt stifled and undervalued. Jaghatai's aloofness and preference for action over politics left him somewhat isolated among the Primarchs. If his isolation had deepened, if he had not made a friend in Magnus, perhaps it might have fostered resentment or a sense of abandonment. He needed genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. He got that, for the most part, from his legion, but if he'd had no strong bonds with any of his brothers, that might have left him vulnerable to manipulation or despair. While the Khan respected the Emperor, he was not blind to the Emperor's flaws. If the Emperor's overt tyranny or betrayal of ideals that Jaghatai held dear were smushed in his face, the Khan might have reconsidered his allegiance. In canon, his physical distance from the Emperor and the Imperium allowed him to overlook its worst hypocrisies. He could ignore them. They were far away. He needed to believe in the righteousness of the Emperor's vision. A clear divergence between his ideals and the actions of the Emperor might have thus eroded his loyalty. The Imperium's tendency towards authoritarianism and its treatment of its people clashed with the Khan's sense of honor. He needed reassurance that the Imperium's goals aligned with his sense of justice and freedom. Prolonged exposure to moral compromises might have driven him to question his role. Isolation from the emperor led to a lack of emotional connection with the emperor. This might have created some doubts in Jaghatai about his place in the Grand Cruise design. He needed a sense of personal investment from the emperor to reinforce his belief in their shared mission. I believe that the campaign at Molech, in which he and the White Scars were one of the 4 legions called upon by the emperor to bring that world into compliance, directly at the emperor's side, may have been what helped him in canon to see that the emperor valued him. But ultimately, it was not Molech that did it. It was Jaghatai Khan's personal code of honor, philosophical alignment with the higher values of the emperor and the Imperium, and his commitment to humanity's future, which outweighed these potential fault lines. He was able to focus on the broader vision of the Imperium and his relative isolation from the toxic politics of the Imperium, to shield him from many of the pressures that led certain other Primarchs astray. Let's take a moment to observe that the White Scars, Raven Guard, and Dark Angels all operated at times independently, autonomously, and far from the main body of the Crusade, with limited contact or oversight, and they stayed loyal. We'll talk about the Dark Angels later. I maintain that they stayed loyal. Meanwhile, the Luna Wolves, Death Guard, Iron Warriors, and World Eaters were often fighting right at the heart of the Crusade in the main theaters of the war, with plenty of opportunity for communication and oversight with Imperial institutions, and they fell to chaos. So proximity to the Emperor, Imperial institutions, or the main body of the Crusade were not decisive factors in loyalty or betrayal. This reinforces the central thesis which has been developing throughout this series. It's all about the unmet emotional needs of individual Primarchs. The emotional landscape of the Primarchs and their ability or inability to have their core needs met is what determined their ultimate allegiance. I'm calm now. Jaghatai Khan needed respect for autonomy and a harmonious philosophy. And the Khan's independence was not just tolerated, but rather facilitated by the emperor, allowing him to thrive in his element and focus on the big picture rather than on internal politics. And so there was loyalty that sprang from that, born of respect and alignment with his core values. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard had the emotional needs of justice and fairness and freedom from tyranny, and the Emperor trusted Corax to liberate Lycaeus on his own terms and refrain from micromanaging his methods in the Great Crusade. This affirmed Corax's values and established a foundation of respect leading to loyalty. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels, a complicated figure. We'll get to him fucking later. You can wait. But he needed to feel in control, and he needed recognition of his calculated brilliance. The Emperor entrusted the Lion with difficult and delicate tasks, especially saving the Imperium from destruction in the Second and Third Rangdan Xenocides, thus acknowledging the Lion's strategic and tactical genius. He saw the Legion's secrecy as a necessary strength rather than a liability, and directly encouraged this by, for example, allowing them to use weapons which were absolutely forbidden for anyone else, like AI, but we'll get to that later. Thus, Lionel Johnson had loyalty born of his responsibilities and the trust that the Emperor had in his judgment. Meanwhile, the traitor Primarchs operating in the core of the Great Crusade. Horus Lupercal, he had the emotional needs of validation and to be first among equals. And after Horus was elevated to War Master, he had the first among equals part, but he felt increasingly alienated by the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra, thus losing the validation which he needed directly from the Emperor. As a result, there was betrayal, fueled by wounded pride and the ensuing resentment. Mortarion had the emotional need for freedom from tyranny and from oppression, and the purity which came from eschewing the use of psychers. The Imperium's broad use of psychers, not just astropaths and navigators, but also before the Council at Nicaea, librarians and such, clashed with Mortarion's values, and he felt that his efforts were largely undervalued compared to other Primarchs. And this is before we even get into the mess of how the Emperor met Mortarion. And so we end with betrayal, driven by disillusionment with the Emperor's principles. The Emperor used psychers a whole lot. The Emperor was a tyrant, and so Mortarion, who didn't like either of those things, fell. Perturabo had the emotional needs of recognition and a sense of purpose in his sacrifices. Constantly overshadowed by Dorn, underappreciated, and assigned the worst tasks in the Crusade, Perturabo thus saw his loyalty as unreciprocated. So, as a result, there was betrayal stemming from bitterness and envy. Angron was a fucking mess, and we talked about him earlier. He had the emotional need of brotherhood, a meaningful life, and connections with others. But he was forced by the Emperor, just teleporting him away, to abandon his gladiator comrades on Nuceria, and so he found himself trapped in a life of endless slaughter in the Great Crusade under the Emperor's command. As a result, he betrayed the Emperor, rooted in his rage and his isolation from others. Thus, we can see from these 7 examples, and from a bunch of others we talk about elsewhere, loyalty was not about distance. There were emotional needs as the deciding factors. The White Scars, Raven Guard, and Dark Angels operated in isolation. They were allowed to flourish within their own frameworks, and this ensured that their emotional needs were met. Those 4 traitor Primarchs we spoke about operated right at the core, right in the main theaters of the Great Crusade. They had ample opportunity for communication with the Emperor and Imperium, and the interactions that they had either exacerbated their feelings of neglect, disillusionment, or resentment, or didn't address those concerns. The Emperor's failure was not as a strategist, it was as a father. He completely failed to understand and address the emotional and psychological needs of his sons because he refused to see them as his sons. He thought of them as tools. Each betrayal against him was a cry of unmet needs, and each loyalist was a testament to those needs being acknowledged, sometimes by accident. The tragedy of the Horus heresy was one of family. The greatest strengths and failures of the Imperium were rooted in the personal, human dynamics of the Primarchs with their brothers and with their father. What notable engagements did the White Scars participate in prior to the Horus heresy, unsupported by other legions? And how did Jaghatai Khan grow and change from these engagements? Well, they operated with a high degree of independence, often involving rapid strike campaigns and hit-and-run tactics against superior forces, out on the fringes of imperial expansion. These engagements thus showcased the White Scars' adaptability and reinforced their distinct approach to war, deeply shaping Jaghatai Khan's perspective on leadership in the Imperium's mission. But because they're off on their own, they are less well represented in canon. The Chandax campaign is a good example of one which is at least somewhat discussed in canon. The White Scars were deployed to pacify Orcs' forces in the Chandax system following the Ulanor triumph and Horus's promotion to War Master. They used their mobility and hit-and-run tactics to disrupt and dismantle the Orc war machine, thus achieving victory with fewer losses than could have been feared. For Jaghatai, this then strengthened his belief in the superiority of flexible, mobile warfare, reinforced his disdain for static, attritional strategies, and reinforced the confidence that he had in his own legion. So, for the liberation of Jaga, I was not able to find primary sources in canon for this fight between the White Scars and the Orcs during the Great Crusade. Only second-hand information in material which was primarily concerned with the Orcs' use of Jaga as a base of operations much later, during the Second War for Armageddon. Just go with it. So, Jaghatai Khan led the White Scars to liberate human populations enslaved by Orcs. The White Scars' rapid strikes thus dismantled the raiders, restoring autonomy to the human population. What Jaghatai Khan got out of this was a bolstered sense of moral responsibility to protect humanity's freedom, and a heightened understanding of the challenges of balancing liberation of a new population and integration into the Imperium, which, of course, involves subjecting the population to the Imperium's quite rigid autocratic systems. All right, the first war against the Sarash Empire. The Sarash, a technologically advanced but morally corrupt human empire, resisted imperial compliance. Jaghatai's decisiveness and disdain for the Sarash's oppressive practices led to their swift defeat and acceptance of imperial compliance, despite offers of alliance. Now, this is more complicated than that. We'll get to that in a moment. But at least initially, what Jaghatai learned was a strengthened commitment to the emperor's vision of unification and a reinforcement of his moral opposition to tyranny. Now, most of the White Scars' operations occurred on the periphery of imperial records, targeting minor Xenos empires and lost human colonies of not sufficiently galactic scale stature as to be recorded in canon novels. But in general, what we know for Jaghatai Khan is that his legion's actions during these more routine operations refined his understanding of the balance between freedom and order. It developed a sharper awareness of the Imperium's failings in addressing the cultural diversity among its worlds, while at the same time imposing autocratic rule, and deepened his understanding of how best to use hit-and-run tactics and such in conjunction with other parts of warfare in order to improve his leadership of the White Scars Legion. Jaghatai learned to adapt his ideals to the practical realities of warfare. He understood that, while he valued freedom, some compromises were necessary to achieve the larger goal of humanity's survival. So that's why he put up with the autocratic government of the Imperium. But his experience on the Imperium's fringe deepened his sense of detachment from the core institutions of the Crusade and the Imperium. The rigidity of the Imperium clashed with his personal and cultural values, fostering a growing awareness of its flaws. And by the time of the Horus Heresy, the White Scars were worried that they were either going to have to completely change how they operated or else become obsolete in the coming Imperium, repeatedly leading more or less unsupported operations, forced Jaghatai to rely on his instincts and his trust in his legion's unique capabilities. This honed his ability to inspire loyalty and foster autonomy among his warriors, but perhaps weakened their ability to work with other institutions, such as the Imperial Army or the Armada Imperialis, the precursor to the Imperial Navy. Contact with various human cultures and an understanding that as they were integrated into the Imperium, a more uniform governing style was going to be imposed upon them by the imperial autocracy despite local traditions. This led to a shaping of his perspective on leadership, the Imperium, and his own place within it. Now that we've talked about those, let's go back to the Serosh. It's my understanding from canon that the war against the Serosh Empire took part in 2 phases. First, the White Scars seemingly brought the world into compliance with a brief military campaign, and then left. And then second, the Dark Angels arrived. They were targeted by an attempted assassination, and they found that the Serosh had been faking compliance while actually attempting to summon a daemon. So ultimately the Dark Angels had to fight a battle that the White Scars had seemingly won before. Now this is not well recorded in canon, but I wonder what effect did these events have on Jaghatai Khan? Did the betrayal of the Serosh after his supposed victory make Jaghatai more sympathetic to the more brutal methods of some of his brothers, such as Kurs, or the more time-consuming methods of others, such as Lorgar, to ensure compliance? We know that the revelation that the Serosh had been faking compliance and plotting treachery had a profound effect on Lionel Johnson. But had Jaghatai Khan learned of it, which one can expect he may have, then perhaps this event would have forced him to confront the limitations of his preferred approach to warfare and compliance, which emphasized speed, decisive action, but also trust and extending a hand of peace to those who want to surrender. This also would have illuminated the darker realities of imperial compliance, where cultural or spiritual resistance can fester beneath the surface even after apparent victory. Before the Serosh betrayal, the White Scars' approach to compliance was rooted in the belief that once a foe was militarily defeated, they could integrate into the Imperium safely without prolonged oversight. After the betrayal, the Serosh's duplicity would have demonstrated that compliance required more than military dominance. It demanded cultural and ideological transformation. Perhaps he may have thus understood and appreciated the role that human imperial institutions played in bringing compliance to its full flower after the initial military victory. Perhaps the betrayal may have led Jaghatai to reflect on Kurs' brutal enforcement of compliance through fear, aiming to eliminate any chance of rebellion. We know that Jaghatai still rejected Kurs' methods as excessive and contrary to his values, but perhaps he may have seen a bit of the logic behind them. Now, from everything I can see in canon, Jaghatai Khan did not know about what Lorgar had been doing. Lorgar's slower, more spiritual approach to ensuring compliance by reshaping cultural beliefs was done on his own. He was independent from the main body of the crusade. So that means that there would have been no obvious way for Jaghatai Khan to learn about what Lorgar was doing. They were both distant from the crusade and from each other. In any case, the Khan's distaste for dogma and his independent methods would have made him wary of such methods. But ultimately, the Serosh incident should have instilled a greater caution in Jaghatai Khan regarding the loyalty of newly compliant worlds. Perhaps it would have been good for him to advocate for deeper intelligence gathering or increased monitoring to detect hidden resistance. But, from what we know in canon, it did not change the pace of his legion's victories. So perhaps he was relying on the White Scars' independent mobile operations style, allowing them to revisit and reassess worlds if needed from bubbling up rebellion later. Or perhaps he was relying on a Iron Hands situation, where you just conquer and then move on and let the humans of the Imperium deal with the aftermath. Ultimately, we know from canon that if Jaghatai Khan learned of the Serosh betrayal, it did not substantially change how his legion operated. He definitely did not switch over to a Kurs sort of method, but perhaps it did make their Primarch appreciate the complexity of the compliance process. It may have made him more sympathetic to the challenges faced by his brothers who used differing methods, even though he did not adopt their approaches. Sorry about the dogs outside. I don't know if you can hear that. So now we've covered engagements that the White Scars took part in on their own, but there were some important engagements that the White Scars participated in alongside other legions. Perhaps we might look at how Jaghatai Khan changed and grew in response. Those combined force engagements, rare as they were important, would have provided him with opportunities to broaden his perspective, adapt his methods, and develop relationships with his brothers. Now, how much he actually did those things is an open question in canon. The most famous, of course, was the Ullanor campaign, a 3-legion conquest of the Ullanor orcs led by war boss Orlak Urg, which in most recent canon I believe involved the Luna Wolves, well, Sons of Horus later, but still at that point, the Luna Wolves, Ultramarines, and White Scars. It was either the most, or behind the Ranged and Xenocides, the second most significant triumph of the Great Crusade. It was a massive combined effort. Orlak Urg's orc horde was large enough to be an existential threat to the growing Imperium. The White Scars' role was that they excelled in their usual capacity for rapid assaults, hit-and-run attacks, and flanking maneuvers, harrying orc supply lines, weakening their ability to reinforce key positions, and making devastating flanking attacks when the orcs were busy dealing with the Luna Wolves or Ultramarines on the front lines. Jaghatai Khan, during this engagement, observed Horus's ability to lead large-scale, coordinated operations, thus contrasting with his own preference for mobility, decentralization, and unit-based decision-making. Thus, Jaghatai respected Horus's tactical acumen and learned its place, but he remained skeptical of the rigidity required for such operations on a smaller scale. This campaign demonstrated the value of unity among the legions, working together, thus reinforcing Jaghatai's loyalty to the Emperor and the Great Crusade. And it also affirmed his belief, and the belief of Horus and the Emperor, that the White Scars' methods filled a crucial niche in the Imperium's arsenal. Now, the compliance of Chondax, I believe from canon that the White Scars worked alongside the Space Wolves. This was a difficult campaign against orc warbands entrenched across multiple planets. The White Scars used their mobility to draw orc forces into ambushes orchestrated by Russ's Legion, a not unknown tactic for the Space Wolves themselves, often using the Blood Claws. Well, anyway, we'll talk about tactics and stuff with Space Wolves later, maybe. Jaghatai admired the ferocity and effectiveness of the Space Wolves, but found their methods overly direct. This participation in the campaign with them thus highlighted the importance of maintaining the White Scars' flexibility and their ability to adapt to unconventional situations. While they respected each other's combat prowess, though, their cultural differences limited the depth of their relationship. The Khan was deeply aware, acutely aware, that the broader Imperium thought the Space Wolves and White Scars to be similarly savage. The campaign with the Space Wolves thus reinforced Jaghatai Khan's sense that the White Scars had a distinct identity, all their own. Also of note, Arco and Droon. We'll talk about Droon elsewhere. Oh, and Molech. He did participate in the compliance of Molech. Through these engagements, Jaghatai Khan thus developed in several key ways. Collaborating with other legions allowed him to appreciate the diversity of the varied methods and philosophies of his brothers, which all worked together to achieve greater results than any of them could have done independently. So yes, even though he disagreed with the general combat strategies of the Luna Wolves, he understood that they were very useful, especially in conjunction with his own. Exposure to large-scale operations thus helped him to understand the value of coordination and long-term strategy, though he remained committed to the White Scars' ethos of adaptability. Each collaboration thus reinforced the distinct identity of the White Scars and their critical role in the Crusade. solidifying his belief in his legion's unique strengths. On Chogoris, the ability to use psychic powers was called the Test of Heaven, and it was well known by the people of the Khan's homeworld that the warp and the use of psychic powers could corrupt. The Khan respected psychic powers and did a great deal of work to establish a formalized librarius within his legion and then spread to other legions, so that the Psykers of the White Scars, the Stormseers, could use their powers for the betterment of the Great Crusade. At the Council of Nicaea, he and Sanguinius were among the proponents of a formal, structured use of psychic powers within the legions, different from the Mortarian ban-it-all argument, or the Magnus warp prophet argument. Now, this council at Nicaea was the last major event that the emperor participated in prior to the heresy. How did Jaghatai Khan thus react to the emperor's ban on any psychic powers, which was really aimed at punishing Magnus, but thus caught other legions incidentally? The Khan understood that with discipline and moral integrity, psychic powers could be wielded responsibly. His belief in the structured use of psychic powers thus demonstrated his pragmatism and adaptability. He saw the value in the use of psychers to enhance his legion's capabilities. We'll talk about Droon later, especially through battlefield support or through divination. The Emperor's decree thus blindsided him. The Emperor's ban on psychic powers, except for the astropaths and the navigators, which were necessary for the Imperium's continued functioning, disappointed the Khan, but he respected the decision out of loyalty to the Emperor and recognition of the larger context of the warp's dangers. Yes, the librarians had been very useful for him and for other Primarchs, but the Emperor was more knowledgeable about these things than he. So even though he disagreed with the decision, he wasn't about to continue to use Stormseers in secret, so far as I can tell from what canon I have read. He was disappointed in the ban, but he did not rebel against the Emperor as a result of it. He respected the Emperor's authority and believed in the Emperor's vision for humanity. Jaghatai's understanding of the dangers of the warp, drawn from his traditions on Chogoris, made him sympathetic to the concerns of those advocating for the ban. Thus, just as the test of heaven on his homeworld emphasized the dangers of the corrupting influence of the warp, the Emperor's ban, while he felt that this outright prohibition ignored the potential to channel psychic powers safely through discipline like his Stormseers had done. Even though he disagreed with it, he felt that it was not perhaps a complete mistake. Despite internal misgivings, he adapted to the decree. He directed the Stormseers to focus on non-psychic leadership roles and had them fight with blade and bolter like any of their brothers. They remained integral to the White Scars' identity even as their powers went unused. He did not go the Imperial Fist's insane direction of imprisoning his Psykers. Completely wild that Dorn did that, but whatever. He also did not go the Space Wolves' hypocritical route of claiming that their powers were somehow different and not psychic, and then just continue using them. No. The Khan knew what the Stormseers were doing. So yeah, Russ deceived himself, but the Khan was too smart for that. Overall, though, the council at Nicaea reinforced Jaghatai's awareness of the political and ideological tensions within the Imperium. It was a reminder of the challenges that the Emperor faced in maintaining unity among the disparate cultures and philosophies of the Legion. Thus, Jaghatai knew, even going into Nicaea, that he had to be cautious about openly advocating for controversial ideas. He recognized the potential for division. Jaghatai's stance at Nicaea aligned him with Magnus to some extent, thus possibly strengthening their existing relationship. But Magnus's tantrum after the ban at Nicaea would not have endeared him to Jaghatai Khan. There was still work to be done. The White Scars went back to the Great Crusade after. He, as far as I can tell from canon, did not say anything in particular about the Thousand Sons retreating from the Crusade and just staying on their home world. The early hours of the Horus heresy, after Horus's betrayal became apparent, were filled with confusion. It is well documented in one of the novels that Jaghatai Khan spent time and effort to make sure he was doing the right thing, going to great pains to determine that Russ was loyal and that Magnus had fallen, before heeding Dorn's command and making for Terra to defend against the coming attacks, despite Dorn not being his superior and not really being in a place to issue commands. How does this thoughtful approach of the Khan compare with other Primarchs? Well, for one, we might look at Russ jumping at the chance to attack Prospero. The difference between the two thus highlights fundamental aspects of their personalities, leadership styles, and emotional needs, showing the Khan to be a much more thoughtful, introspective character who was willing to think before he acted. The Khan's insistence on verifying loyalties and understanding the broader situation thus reflects his deep-seated belief in acting only when he is confident in the righteousness of his actions. His behavior thus aligned with his cultural upbringing on Chagoris, where decisions carried life or death consequences in the unforgiving environment of the steppes. The need for foresight and careful judgment was ingrained in him from an early age. Now, some Primarchs were quick to follow orders without question, notably Dorn. But Jaghatai's independence allowed him the luxury of evaluating the unfolding betrayal without succumbing to rash judgments or external pressures. His refusal to act hastily shows a maturity and self-assuredness that other Primarchs would have been well served to develop on themselves, notably Russ. The Khan, what I can see in this period, had a lingering hope to avoid unnecessary conflict. He sought to honor the bonds of brotherhood by double-checking before engaging in conflict, so he verified that Russ was loyal before he acted. In comparison, Leman Russ was an impulsive, impatient baby throwing a tantrum. Russ's immediate willingness to attack Prospero and try to kill Magnus on the flimsiest of justifications, his immediate willingness to escalate his campaign into the destruction of Prospero, and the ease at which Horus convinced him to take this path highlights his straightforward and emotional nature. Russ's actions were influenced by his loyalty to the Emperor, yes, but also his belief that Magnus's betrayal was absolute made it easy for Horus to twist Russ's loyalty into fanaticism. His lack of deeper inquiry into the situation left him vulnerable to Horus's manipulation of the Order to lead Russ to try to destroy the Thousand Sons entirely. Russ's warrior ethos emphasized decisive, instinctive action over prolonged deliberation, which was a strength in many situations, but this was a profound flaw when nuanced judgment was required. Russ's swift and uncompromising actions at Prospero thus alienated Magnus and the Thousand Sons. Magnus, of course, had not been planning to fight back. Had Russ just gone there to arrest them and bring them to Terra, they might have gone along with it. Because of that, we can see that his attack led directly to Magnus's fall to chaos. His intentions were loyal, but his lack of introspection, his lack of forethought, thus expanded the heresy's scope, pushing the Thousand Sons to the side of chaos. We'll talk about the Thousand Sons later. Russ sought validation through action and loyalty, while Jaghatai only sought validation through his sons. So he needed understanding and justice and truth. This divergence reflects the differing responses to betrayal. Russ acted swiftly to uphold what he thought was the Emperor's will, while Jaghatai paused to ensure his actions were aligned with his moral code and supported by the facts on the ground. A reminder through all this, Russ attacked Prospero before the Istvan betrayals, but the timeline doesn't matter so much as the general theme of betrayal followed by Russ flying off the handle. Anyway, Jaghatai's careful navigation of the early heresy underscores the value of deliberation and foresight in leadership. His method allowed him to avoid unnecessary conflicts and make principled decisions, thus reinforcing his integrity. This approach was thus able to help maintain morale and unity within the White Scars, because they could trust that their Primarch would act with reason rather than haste. By seeking clarity, Jaghatai thus shielded himself and his legion from manipulation by Horus, or notably Alpharius, when Horus ordered Alpharius to try to turn the Khan towards chaos. This contrasts with Russ, who became an unwitting pawn in Horus's scheme to isolate Magnus from the Imperium and send him to the side of chaos. The Khan's willingness to chart his own course there thus demonstrates the strength of his independent spirit. His capacity to question the actions of his brothers, or the inaction of the Emperor, highlights his commitment to doing what he believed was right. From this, we can see some broader implications for the unfolding Horus heresy. Jaghatai's thoughtful approach was ultimately critical in steering the White Scars toward Terra and reinforcing the loyalist cause. His actions show us a delicate balance of independence and loyalty, principles which were not always in harmony among the Primarchs. Russ leaned too heavily into what he believed to be loyalty, thus making him easy to manipulate because he lacked introspection. Magnus, meanwhile, veered into independence at the expense of restraint, but Jaghatai's balance set him apart as a figure of wisdom and stability. The White Scars had a different experience of the Siege of Terra than did their allies, the Imperial Fists or Blood Angels. Dorn ended the campaign having secured a Pyrrhic victory in which he could find no satisfaction. Sanguinius went to his final battle with Horus knowing that he was predestined to die, leaving his legion cursed with the Black Rage forevermore. The White Scars, meanwhile, won an unambiguous victory when they retook the Lion's Gate spaceport and its surface-to-orbit weaponry, thus cutting the logistical capabilities and ability to resupply for the traitor legions in half. And yet, Jaghatai Khan did not get the opportunity to fight against Horus in the climactic final battle aboard Horus's flagship. I wonder then about his mental state following the Siege of Terra. Did he, like Dorn, blame himself for the Emperor's grievous wounds? Did he blame Dorn or Sanguinius for failures? I feel that Jaghatai Khan's experience during and after the Siege of Terra thus present an intriguing study of his emotional resilience. Unlike Dorn or the dead Sanguinius, Jaghatai emerged from the siege with a distinct perspective shaped by unambiguous victory, coupled with being sidelined at the final act. The Khan understood the immense accomplishment of the White Scars and their undeniable contribution to the Loyalist defense. Retaking the Lion's Gate spaceport was a pivotal achievement which helped to preserve Terra's defenses, ensure that the Loyalists could continue to resist the traitor legions, and delayed the traitors' advance under Perturabo's leadership long enough that reinforcements were about to arrive, thus causing Horus to have to speed things up with his gambit. But at the same time, his philosophical mindset would have tempered any triumphalism. Jaghatai understood the transitory nature of both victory and loss. He understood that survival depended on knowing when to fight and when to retreat. I have not found any material in the Horus Heresy novels about Jaghatai being introspective about the climactic confrontation with Horus and how he missed it. Obviously, his warrior ethos would have led him to yearn for the chance to confront the War Master directly, just like how he sought after the Daemon Prince Fulgrim to kill him, to try to release Fulgrim's human soul. But, unlike Dorn, who fixated on the Emperor's wounds as a personal failing, I think Jaghatai came out from this seeing the Emperor's fate as a consequence of the chaotic, unrelenting, and unpredictable nature of war. Sometimes people get injured. Sometimes people get killed. It wasn't the Emperor's fault. It wasn't Dorn's fault, and it sure wasn't Jaghatai's fault. Yes, Jaghatai mourned the Emperor's grievous wounds and entombment upon the Golden Throne. He mourned the broader cost of the Siege of Terra, but his cultural and personal philosophy would have helped him to avoid being consumed by guilt. In his worldview, a battlefield is a place of unpredictability, where even the most meticulously laid plans can go awry. Jaghatai knew that Dorn, in coordinating the massive effort of defending Terra and the Imperial Palace, coordinating disparate forces with varying different capabilities and specializations, those were skills that Jaghatai lacked. He knew that from the Olenor experience. That was not a skill set he had. So he respected Dorn's steadfastness and defensive genius and acknowledged the immense burden that Dorn shouldered during the siege. But he may have felt that Dorn's focus on defense left little room for flexibility. That's why he kind of had to go off on his own to take the Lionsgate spaceport. By on his own, I mean like with his legion, not like just him. That'd be silly. Regarding his brother Sanguinius, with whom he had not had such a close relationship as Magnus, but still had warm feelings towards. He admired Sanguinius's grace under pressure, but his sacrifice resonated deeply with the Khan, who valued courage and honor on the battlefield and mourned those who were lost. Jaghatai definitely did not blame Sanguinius. He saw his death as an act of ultimate loyalty and bravery, a tragic necessity in the defense of Terra and the Imperium. Afterwards, Jaghatai turned to self-reflection to process the events of the siege himself. His upbringing and cultural values taught him to seek balance and clarity. And so he may have seen the Emperor's wounding as part of a larger cycle of destruction and renewal. He saw the siege as one part of an ongoing struggle for the Imperium's survival. And then he and his legion moved on to the next portion. They used their powers, they used their remaining strength, despite the casualties they had suffered during the war, to participate in the scouring. Unlike Dorn, who became consumed by grief and blaming himself, leading his legion into the trap that the Iron Warriors had set for them at the Iron Cage, the Khan's focus on adaptability and forward momentum drove him to look beyond the immediate aftermath of the siege, thus concentrating on participating in the scouring campaign and rebuilding the White Scars to prepare for wars to come. The Khan's characteristic emotional independence and emotional distance may have helped him to avoid the deep torment that plagued Dorn, but it may also have isolated him from his brothers and from the more centralized rebuilding efforts led by Guilliman. From all of this, the Khan's philosophical approach positioned him uniquely among his brothers in the post-heresy landscape. He continued to defend the Imperium with a clear vision, unclouded by the paralyzing regret or grief that consumed some of his siblings. He was just back in the saddle, ready to fight, just like before. After the siege of Tara, Jaghatai Khan played a crucial but understated role in the Scouring. His legion had taken a great number of losses during the siege of Tara, and so he was unable to contribute so many forces as notably the Ultramarines. True to the White Scars' traditions, they continued to favor hit-and-run tactics and rapid strikes, acting autonomously during the Scouring. This approach was quite useful against the fragmenting, retreating traitor legions, who were unable to put up a unified front against the attacks of the Loyalists. By isolating traitor forces and cutting off the forces of the traitor legions from what supply lines they still had, the White Scars were able to reclaim strategically vital worlds. While the Khan typically preferred independence, he cooperated with other loyalist legions and imperial forces when it was necessary. His relationship with Guilliman may have been strengthened during this time, as Guilliman took the lead in the offensive campaigns of the Scouring against the traitors, naturally causing the two of them to work closely together more often than they had before. Jaghatai, of course, harbored a personal vendetta against the traitor legions for their betrayal and the havoc they had wreaked on humanity, thus fueling his determination to hunt them down and to prevent chaos from gaining further ground. The Scouring reinforced Jaghatai's belief in adaptability and decisiveness. The need for rapid, effective action against a dispersed enemy fit his strengths, but his lack of participation in the Imperium's rebuilding highlights the challenges of his independent streak. While his loyalty to the Imperium never wavered, his preference for autonomy and his legion's distance, even during these more cooperative times led by Guilliman, deepened his sense of detachment from imperial institutions. The Emperor was dead, so what he had remaining was his legion. This separation may have thus contributed to his eventual decision to turn towards matters of warfare exclusively. Jaghatai Khan's story does not conclude with a clear death, as with Dorn fighting in battle, for example. Rather, he disappeared while pursuing the Drukhari, Dark Eldar, into the Webway. This makes him one of the more enigmatic Primarchs. He's one of those that Games Workshop could bring back, like Vulcan or Leman Russ. But on the other hand, he did not choose to leave the Imperium for 10,000 years. He was just fighting. It happened by accident. So unlike Korax or Vulcan or Leman Russ, his coming back may not be entirely his decision. The Khan's disappearance is tied to his unwavering dedication to protecting his homeworld, and by extension, protecting the other worlds of the Imperium. The Drukhari raid on Chogoris, which targeted the population for their own vile purposes many times before, was a direct threat to everything he held dear. Now, only in some canon is this Drukhari raid on Chogoris itself. In others, he's just fighting them just in general. It doesn't really specify what. Regardless, canon is clear that Jaghatai pursued the Drukhari into the Webway. His decision to enter this perilous domain that only the Eldar really understand at all speaks to his fearlessness and his personal commitment to justice and vengeance. Entering the Webway without a clear plan for return reflects his ethos of prioritizing the immediate protection of his people over long-term personal safety. Now, there are a number of fan theories speculating as to his fate, which we might engage with. One plausible theory is that the Khan became trapped within the Webway, unable to find his way back to real space. This fate would thus align with his solitary nature and the willingness to sacrifice for his people, but it would not place himself it would not place the Khan forever out of an emerging canon. Another option is that he may have been captured or killed by the Drukhari, but I feel that if this were the case, it would have been explored already in some Dark Eldar codex or some such. If he is imprisoned by the Drukhari, it raises interesting questions about whether he might still be alive and able to escape. A more speculative idea is that Jaghatai's journey through the webway led to a personal transformation or ascension, with the warp's unpredictable nature, even in the webway, changing him away from what he was, kind of like what people speculate has been happening with Korax. So this might allow him to eventually return to the Imperium, but not in the way that he had been before. The Khan's final known act thus encapsulates his lifelong commitment to duty and his willingness to act decisively to protect others, even at great personal risk, an example which the White Scars continue to try to live up to. The enigmatic nature of his disappearance reflects his independent spirit. His story ends, so far as it has ended by the time I've recorded this video, as it began, with the Khan charting his own course, unconstrained by external expectations. His disappearance thus leaves open the possibility of a future return, a theme that resonates with the enduring hope that the Imperium holds in its darkest hours. The Khan's actions during the Scouring thus showcase his pragmatism, adaptability, and unshakable loyalty, while his eventual disappearance highlights his personal sense of duty and enigmatic nature. Together, these paint a picture of a leader deeply committed to his ideals, whose story remains open-ended and full of potential for future exploration by Games Workshop. I wonder, either before the Horus Heresy, or after the Scouring, but before his disappearance, how might Jaghatai Khan have been able to contribute to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance? Well, he wasn't known for bureaucracy or politics. I feel there are a few key areas where his influence, had it been properly utilized, might have left a lasting mark. The Khan deeply valued speed, freedom of movement, and interconnectivity, principles which might have translated into reforms in how the Imperium managed its vast territory. With a robust courier and information network, not relying entirely upon astropathic communications, warp-capable fast ships might have been able to ensure rapid dissemination of orders, news, and edicts. He would have almost certainly advocated for greater logistical decentralization, empowering regional authorities with faster response systems to address their needs rather than bottlenecking through the Adeptus Terra. Khan, with his detesting of the stagnation and bloated hierarchy which the Imperium was already displaying in its bureaucracy before the Horus Heresy, the Khan would have certainly pushed for a leaner, more agile governance, with less red tape and more responsiveness. His presence might have helped to counterbalance the overly rigid Adeptus Administratum, whose inflexible systems strangle the Imperium's potential. The Khan had an almost instinctive resistance to oppression, a holdover from his days fighting the tyrants on Trigoris. Perhaps, had he taken an interest in governance, he might have been a vocal opponent of authoritarian excess, perhaps pushing for internal auditing forces to be able to bring the powerful to heel. He certainly favored merit over birth, so he would have rewarded initiative and practical results over the hidebound inherited titles of the imperial nobility. Unlike some Primarchs, Khan had a tolerant approach to different cultures. He respected the traditions of other worlds, just as he expected the nomadic traditions of his own people to be tolerated. This might have led to a more localized governance model across the Imperium, tailored to a planet's culture and strengths, rather than imposing the uniformity of the Adeptus Arbites and the Adeptus Administratum. He would likely have been a champion of frontier worlds, pushing for them to be given greater autonomy and greater control over their resources to be able to better defend themselves and build themselves up. His experience with raiders and ungoverned wilds would have made him an ideal voice for managing the fringes of Imperial space in a way which better served their needs rather than the central control of the Imperium. But Jaghatai never liked Terra or its trappings. He avoided the politicking of other Primarchs and kept his legion as far away from bureaucracy as he could. So he wasn't about to engage in non-military governance. And the Emperor was never interested in having the Primarchs take on any substantial non-military role, or at least not during the Great Crusade, when he was still around. After the heresy, he disappeared into the webway, his insights lost at a critical moment when the Imperium desperately needed new visions to be able to change and grow. His absence, like the absence of so many others, thus allowed more rigid and oppressive systems to grow and strangle the Imperium's potential. Looking through the Fisher King lens, then, which imperial institution might be seen as linked to Jaghatai Khan? What failings of the post-heresy Imperium could be linked thematically with his absence? I feel that Jaghatai Khan is an excellent thematic match for the rogue traders. His values of adaptability, autonomy, cultural respect, and acting out on the fringes of imperial space resonate with the ideals of rogue traders as independent agents tasked with expanding the Imperium's reach into uncharted space. His absence is thus reflected in the stagnation, exploitation, and rigidity that now define these institutions, mirroring the Imperium's broader failings in exploration and integration. Rogue traders are granted extraordinary freedom to explore the galaxy and establish new trade routes, much like Jaghatai's own preference for independence and unbridled exploration. They're charged with navigating cultural complexities and dealing with sometimes even Xenos populations, but they're finding and interacting with new human populations to forge alliances would have aligned very well with Jaghatai's respect for cultural diversity and his ability to unify disparate groups. Like the White Scars, the rogue traders often operate on the fringes of imperial space, thriving in environments which require adaptability and quick decision-making. And so without Jaghatai's philosophical perspective, rogue traders often descend into exploitation and opportunism, prioritizing personal profit and conquest over meaningful cultural integration. The lack of guidance from a figure like the Khan has thus allowed corruption, greed, and short-sightedness to dominate, making the rogue traders petty tyrants, like we see in the Rogue Trader RPG video game, thus undermining the potential for fostering unity and collaboration on the frontier. More broadly, his nomadic roots make him an ideal symbol for the Imperium's efforts to expand its borders and secure new territories. His ability to unite diverse populations could have provided a blueprint for managing newly compliant worlds without erasing their cultural identities. And so, his absence in the modern Imperium has led to the metaphorical link leading to failings in the Imperium's frontier policies. They've become increasingly rigid and oppressive, erasing local cultures rather than integrating them. with expansion efforts driven by brute force and exploitation, creating resentment and rebellion where there should be loyalty. Perhaps we might see the navigators, the Navis Nobility, Navis Nobile? I forget what it's called, as being linked to Jaghatai Khan. The overall imperial reliance on warp travel and the navigators guiding its vessels through the immaterium might be linked to Jaghatai Khan's focus on speed and maneuverability. His emphasis on exploration might have perhaps driven advances in warp navigation, thus making travel safer and more efficient with more capable, competent navigators. Without the Khan's influence, warp travel remains highly dangerous and inefficient, with little innovation in either the techniques used by navigators or the actual design of warp drives and the Geller field. The navigators' monopoly and the Mechanicum's dogmatic approach to technology have come together to stifle progress, leaving the Imperium quite vulnerable to disruptions in its warp routes. We can see this difficulty in navigating the warp as thus being metaphorically linked with the Khan's absence. Jaghatai's spirit of discovery and openness to new ideas is absent in the Imperium. Institutions like the rogue traders and the navigators have become more concerned with preserving their own power than with advancing the Imperium's capabilities. The Imperium's expansion policies thus reflect the loss of Jaghatai's respect for individuality and cultural diversity. They enforce rigid compliance rather than fostering unity by encouraging local cultural diversity, erasing the unique identities of newly compliant worlds. Rogue traders, who might have served as bridges between newly identified cultures and the broader Imperium, instead act as conquerors or exploiters. They are metaphorically disconnected from the example of the Khan. They prioritize profit over doing their job. The Khan's emphasis on autonomy and adaptability is absent from the Imperium's governance, resulting in a rigid top-down approach which stifles creativity and local problem-solving. This rigidity thus leaves the Imperium poorly equipped to address the unique challenges of frontier worlds, leading to inefficiency and rebellion. Overall, the Khan's ability to unite diverse populations through mutual respect and shared purpose is absent in the Imperium, with his physical absence being reflected in the metaphorical absence of these qualities linked to him, which could have created a more cohesive and resilient Imperium. And so in his absence, the Imperium relies on fear, oppression, and repressive bureaucracy to maintain control, fostering resentment and division instead of loyalty. Jaghatai's absence thus represents, via the Fisher King idea, a wound to the Imperium's spirit of exploration, adaptability, and cultural cohesion. His values of freedom, respect for autonomy, and the love of exploration and discovery have been replaced by stagnation, exploitation, and oppression. The institutions he was metaphorically and thematically linked with, notably the rogue traders and the navigators, now reflect his absence through their own failures. What other matters could we discuss for Jaghatai Khan in order to better understand his emotional needs? How did Jaghatai perceive the Emperor's larger vision for humanity? Did he share the Emperor's optimism and idealism in all things, or did he see flaws in the imperial truth? How much did Jaghatai feel valued by the Emperor, perhaps compared to his brothers? Did this affect his relationship with the Emperor and the Imperium? Was there lingering frustration from the emperor's dismissal of psychic powers at Nicaea? Did the council at Nicaea create feelings of distance or disillusionment within Jaghatai Khan or within his legion overall? What was the function of Chogoris as a cultural anchor? How did his connection to the traditions of Chogoris influence his identity and his personality in ways that we've not yet discussed? Did his time away from Chogoris during the Great Crusade create feelings of longing or guilt? How did those left behind avoid feeling growing senses of resentment, like what happened with Caliban and the Dark Angels, which we'll get to later? What about the broader Imperium? Did Jaghatai Khan ever feel that the Imperium truly respected or understood the White Scars' cultural ethos? Was there frustration at being seen as outsiders among the Astartes? How did the White Scars' unique identity within the Imperium lead to their reaction and their response to the introduction of the Codex Astartes and the Second Founding, splitting their legion into multiple chapters? To what extent did the Khan invest in the personal development of his officers and the rank-and-file Marines of the White Scars Legion? How did his approach to leadership compare to more paternal figures like Gilliman or Vulcan? How did the Khan address potential dissent or dissatisfaction within the White Scars Legion? Were there moments of internal crisis that tested his leadership and emotional resilience? Did the Khan develop any particularly deep friendships with other Primarchs, such as Sanguinius or Corax? How did those relationships shape his outlook on loyalty and trust? Why was Magnus the only one he seems to have had a deep friendship with? And on the other side of things, how did he navigate relationships with Primarchs whose philosophies clashed with his own, like Angron or Perturabo? Did he rely entirely on just physical separation, meaning he never had to fucking deal with them? Were there unresolved tensions with brothers like Angron or Kurs, whose brutality starkly contrasted his more empathetic approach? What about with Russ, with whom his legion was compared in a way that he found unflattering? He didn't want his legion to be known as savages. But then how did this interact with his personal relationship with Russ? How did his preference for mobility and hit-and-run tactics and surgical strikes affect his reputation among his peers, especially given that he was so far away they could not see his direct efforts except during rare multi-legion warfare, such as at Molech or Olenor? Did he ever feel that his methods were undervalued or misunderstood? How did the years of constant conflict, both during the Great Crusade and after, shape his mental state and emotional health? Were there moments when the burdens of leadership seemed overwhelming? How did Jaghatai Khan interact with the Mechanicum, such as during the Great Crusade when laser cannons were first put onto the Predator chassis? What about his modifications to his ship's maneuverability and engines? What about chaos? Did Jaghatai Khan ever grapple with the deeper implications of chaos or the nature of the warp? How did he reconcile his respect for psychic powers among the people of Chogoris with the Path of Heaven, or his own legion with the Storm Seers, their name for librarians? How did he reconcile this with the Imperium's growing paranoia about sorcery, and later with the obvious corruption that the warp had on the traitor legions? Did he ever fear that his own legion, or the librarians within his legion, or even himself, could fall prey to the temptations or corruption of chaos? How did he address the dangers of the warp within his legion's librarium? Did Jaghatai Khan harbor guilt for not being present during the climactic final moments of the Siege of Terra? Did he feel he had fulfilled his duty to the Emperor, or did he believe he could have done more? We've addressed some what-ifs already, but is there canon evidence I've missed that you, the audience, know about? What about his relationship with the surviving loyalist Primarchs after the Horus Heresy? How did his relationship with Guilliman, the de facto leader of the Imperium and Imperial Regent, evolve in the aftermath of the siege? Was there mutual understanding, or did their ideological differences cause friction? As always, I want to know what you find interesting. If any of these questions particularly appeal to you, please leave a comment and then go make your own video.